There are games that arrive quietly, slipping into your hands like something that was always meant to be there, and Pokémon Diamond and Pearl were exactly that kind of game. The year was 2006. The Nintendo DS had begun to settle into the hands of a new generation of players, and Game Freak was ready to bring the Pokémon world into a different kind of light. Sinnoh was waiting. Cold, mountainous, still, and full of a history so old it predated the concept of time itself. The moment you stepped out of Twin Leaf Town and looked north toward the looming shadows of Mount Coronet, something in the air felt different, quieter, more considered, as though this region had been sitting in the dark for a very long time, waiting for someone to come and notice unpreserved. Before you drift any further, please subscribe to join the Cozy Club for more videos like this, and let me know where in the world you are watching from tonight. The Sinnoh region takes its name from a phrase meaning something like a deity that dwells within, and that quiet spiritual presence colors everything about the place. It was designed with the Hokkaido region of Japan in mind, the northernmost of the main islands, a land known for cold winters, heavy snowfall, and a landscape that feels both ancient and removed from the rest of the country. That sense of geographic separation, of a place that exists slightly outside the normal flow of things, becomes essential to understanding what Diamond and Pearl were trying to do as games. From the very first moments of your journey, Sinnoh communicates something through the texture of its environment. The routes between towns are wider than they need to be. The paths through Mount Coronet are long and winding and occasionally lead somewhere unexpected. Even the music shifts in ways that feel less like transitions and more like changes in light, the way a room looks different in the morning than it does at dusk. These games were not in a hurry. They were not asking you to be in a hurry either. And for players who came to them at the right moment, that pace felt less like a flaw and more like an invitation to stay a while. Jubilife City is the first major destination in the Sinnoh region, and it announces itself with a kind of modern energy that feels surprising given how rural the starting town was. There is a television station here, one that broadcasts across the region. There are smartwatches being distributed to young trainers. There is a building dedicated entirely to trading Pokémon with players around the world, a concept so new at the time that it still carried a sense of wonder even in its most mundane form. Jubilife leans into the future, and yet just outside its borders, the grass grows thick and the old stone paths hint at something much older pressing in from the edges. That tension between the modern and the ancient defines Sinnoh in a way that no other region quite manages. Hearthome City has a grand church at its center, its spire visible from the routes that approach it. Celestic Town, tucked into a corner of the region that feels half forgotten, houses a cave filled with murals painted so long ago that no one still living knows exactly who made them. The murals show three figures in water, calm and enormous, and the town's motto is simply that the past lives here. There is no irony in that phrase. The residents of Celestic Town genuinely believe it, and the games treat their belief with complete seriousness. Celestin Town sits near ancient ruins, carved with symbols that respond to the presence of the mysterious, unknown Pokémon, creatures that look like letters from an alphabet that should not exist. Eterna City displays a statue in its center, worn by weather and time, bearing text so faded it requires a magnifying glass to read. The text describes the creation of time and space. Half the letters are gone. And still the statue stands, because someone decided a long time ago that it was worth preserving even imperfectly. These are not background details. In Sinnoh, they are the whole point. Mount Coronet rises through the middle of the region like a spine, bisecting the land into eastern and western halves. From almost any point in Sinnoh, you can see it. It is always there. Its silhouette changes depending on where you are standing, sometimes wide and massive, sometimes a distant peak, barely distinguishable from cloud cover, but always present. At its highest reachable point sits Spear Pillar, an ancient ruin of broken columns and cracked stone that the games present as the place where the Pokemon world began. The universe was made here. Time and space first took shape here, and there is nothing melodramatic about how the game communicates that. It simply shows you a broken old platform near the top of a mountain and lets the mythology do the work. Arceus, the Pokemon described in Sinnoh's mythology as having hatched from a great emptiness before anything else existed, brought Dialga and Palkia into being to create the flow of time and the fabric of space. Then came the Lake Trio, 3 small Pokemon who live in the still water of 3 separate lakes scattered across Sinnoh. Uxie was said to bring knowledge. Mesprit was said to bring emotion. Azelf was said to bring willpower. These gifts were given to humanity, and the mythology treats them not as powers, but as responsibilities, something to be honored and passed down and protected. What makes this mythology feel meaningful rather than decorative is how it connects to the rest of the region's culture. The people of Sinnoh genuinely live by it. They take care of each other. They take care of the land. Orberg City is a mining town, and the work its people do is hard and dusty and carried out deep underground, and yet the gym leader himself descends into the mines each day to work alongside everyone else. Vents were built into the city to cycle fresh air into the tunnels so that no worker would breathe in something harmful. Someone thought carefully about that. Someone decided that the people doing the most difficult labor deserved to breathe clearly while they did it. Pastoria City grew up around the Great Marsh almost accidentally, the way communities sometimes form around a thing they want to protect. The marsh is home to Pokemon found nowhere else in Sinnoh, and the city's residents have organized their entire way of life around ensuring those Pokemon are never disturbed. Visitors come from far away to observe the marsh through designated paths. The city feels deliberate in its gentleness, as though everyone there has thought carefully about how to exist in a place without diminishing it. Sinnoh is full of moments like this, small, quiet examples of people trying to get something right. Cynthia is the champion of Sinnoh, and she is one of the most memorable champions in the series, for reasons that have less to do with the difficulty of her team, though her Garchomp is genuinely formidable, and more to do with how she is written. She is a historian. She spends much of her time traveling Sinnoh, collecting fragments of old stories, trying to understand the region's past, not from a distance but from within it. She appears multiple times before the player reaches the Pokemon League, not to push the story forward, but simply to observe, to share what she knows, to encourage curiosity. When you finally face her, the battle feels less like a test of strength and more like the conclusion of a very long conversation. The story of Pokémon Diamond and Pearl asks, gently and persistently, what it would mean to live without connection. Cyrus is the leader of Team Galactic, and he was raised in Sunnyshore's City, a place full of light and solar panels and the hum of electrical infrastructure. He was raised there, and he was lonely there, and the loneliness calcified into something harder over time. He came to believe that human emotion was a flaw, that the bonds people formed with each other and with Pokemon were weaknesses that held the world back from something cleaner and more perfect. He wanted to unmake the universe and build a new one in which feeling nothing would be the natural state of all things. What makes Cyrus so strange and so unsettling as a villain is how internally consistent he is. He is not angry. He does not shout. He moves through the story like a very cold draft, present and chilling and almost gentle in his certainty. When he speaks to the grunts and commanders of Team Galactic, he describes them as tools rather than companions. He does not feel warmly toward them, even as they work toward his goal. There is always a distance with Cyrus, a gap he made for himself and then forgot how to cross. He stands in opposition to everything Sinnoh represents, and the game never lets you forget that the gifts of emotion, knowledge, and willpower that the Lake Trio gave to humanity are exactly what he wants to erase. Barry, the player character's rival in Diamond and Pearl, is almost a response to Cyrus written into the structure of the game without anyone explaining the comparison aloud. He is loud and rushing and always half a step ahead, constantly forgetting things in his eagerness, constantly running into situations without thinking them through. He is impatient in a way that is endearing rather than aggressive. He does not want to hurt anyone. He simply wants to get there, wherever there happens to be at any given moment, before everyone else. He finds you 1 million Pokémon dollars every time he bumps into you and seems genuinely to believe he will eventually collect. Barry works as a rival because the game is not really asking you to compete with him. It is asking you to walk at your own pace through a region that rewards patience and attention. Barry's purpose is partly comic, his frantic energy a contrast to the stillness of Sinnoh, and partly something more meaningful. When Commander Jupiter defeats him at Lake Acuity, it is the first time in the game that his rushing has cost him something real. He arrives at Spear Pillar afterward, having slowed down, having trained properly, having thought about what he was doing. He fights alongside you there, and it is not a triumphant moment so much as a quiet one. He learned something. It took losing for him to learn it. The roots of Sinnoh have a particular quality of light that the original Nintendo DS hardware rendered imperfectly but memorably. The trees in Eterna Forest are dense and overlapping, and the path through them feels genuinely enclosed, like moving through something that does not quite want you to pass. The abandoned mansion at the edge of the forest, where a peculiar collection of items and strange encounters waited in the upper rooms, added a layer of unease that the forest itself somehow amplified. Floroma Meadow sits just west of Eterna and feels like a completely different atmosphere, open and bright and covered in flowers that sway in a way the game can only suggest with limited animation. The contrast between those two areas, reached one after the other in the early hours of the game, establishes early that Sinnoh is a region of quiet extremes. Snow Point City is reached only after a journey that takes the player through the deepest sections of Mount Coronet and then through a blizzard thick enough that visibility drops almost to nothing. After all of that, the city itself is small, a handful of houses, a port, a temple that is sealed, a gym. The snow settles across the rooftops and the paths between buildings, and there is a sense of profound quiet that comes from being very far from anywhere else. Snow Point is at the northern edge of the map, and being there feels like it. The resident Pokémon in the surrounding routes include a Bombasnow, a creature that resembles an evergreen tree wrapped around something vast and cold, and their presence among the trees feels completely correct, like they belong to that particular cold more than to any trainer. The Pokémon introduced in Generation 4 have a particular character to them. Many of the most beloved are the ones that take a familiar premise and push it somewhere slightly unexpected. Starly is a small black and white bird in the early routes, unremarkable in the way that early root birds often are, but its evolutions lead somewhere genuinely surprising. Staraptor is fast and striking, its red crest swept back along its head, its expression carrying something between pride and aggression. It can learn close combat, a powerful fighting type move that no one expected a bird to learn, and the combination of that coverage with its speed made it one of the most commonly used Pokémon in playthroughs of the game. Luxray is an electric type that evolves from Shinx, a small blue cub found on early routes. The visual design of the Shinx line traces a shift from light to dark across 3 stages. Shinx is mostly bright blue, with black markings at the edges. Luxio balances the 2 colors in roughly equal measure. Luxray is almost entirely black, with blue marking only around the eyes and at the tips of its limbs. It looks like an animal that has been slowly absorbed by shadow. The electric sparks that appear in its Pokédex entries describe its ability to see through solid objects using its powerful eyes, and there is something about that detail that makes the design feel complete, like the darkness it wears is intentional and functional rather than purely aesthetic. Lucario arrived in Generation 4, having already appeared in a film released prior to the games, and so it carried a weight of recognition when players encountered it. It is a fighting and steel type, blue and black and moving with the posture of something trained rather than wild, and its connection to a mechanic called aura, an invisible force it can sense and manipulate, gives it a depth that extends slightly beyond its moveset. Players responded to it immediately. It became one of the most visible Pokémon from the generation almost overnight, and while it has since appeared in nearly every context imaginable, including other Nintendo game franchises, the original appeal holds. Something about the combination of elegance and power in its design reads clearly without needing explanation. Drifloon appears in the games only on a specific day of the week near a particular windmill, and it is a small purple balloon with a heart-shaped string and enormous hollow eyes. It evolves into Drifblim, a much larger balloon creature with a kind of dreamy vacantness to its expression. Both Pokémon are ghost and flying types, and their Pokédex entries describe them as carrying off children and wandering aimlessly and losing track of where they are going. The games present this with complete serenity, no tension or warning, just a simple description of a balloon that might take you somewhere far away if you hold on too long. This tonal quality, unsettling information delivered gently, is one of the quieter pleasures of Generation 4's design. Garchomp is the pseudo-legendary of Generation 4, the powerful dragon and ground type found late in the game that became central to competitive play almost immediately upon the game's release. Its design is sleek and fast-looking even while standing still, a deep blue with yellow and red accents that suggest heat and speed simultaneously. Garchomp's Pokédex entries describe it as capable of flying at jet aircraft speeds while hunting prey, which feels consistent with how the creature looks. When Cynthia sends it out in the final battle of the Pokémon League, it arrives with a weight that the preceding members of her team have been building toward. Cynthia's Garchomp is the punctuation at the end of a very long sentence. Generation 4 introduced 29 new evolutions and pre-evolutions for Pokémon that had existed in previous games. This decision was controversial in some quarters, the argument being that it represented a kind of creative dependency on the past, a generation leaning on nostalgia rather than building something entirely new. The counter to that argument lies in looking at what those evolutions actually accomplished. Togekiss gave a form to Togetic that made it genuinely compelling in ways the previous stage never quite managed. Roserade took Roselia, a Pokémon that felt somehow incomplete, and gave it a final form of such elegance that the question of why it had not existed before became difficult to answer. Mismagius extended the Misdreavus line into something darker and more deliberately witch-like, the purple robes trailing behind it, suggesting a figure out of folklore. Honchkrow took Murkrow, a small and somewhat rough-looking crow, and evolved it into something wearing a hat and a scarf and carrying itself with an overwhelming sense of self-regard. Electivire and Magmortar took 2 Pokémon that had served as version counterparts through 2 generations and finally gave them the powerful final forms that their stats had always implied they deserved. Yanmega stretched the ancient dragonfly into something faster and more menacing. Gliscor turned the already interesting Gligar into a creature that looked genuinely dangerous. The physical and special split was the mechanical change that Generation 4 made to the underlying systems of Pokemon battle, and it is difficult to overstate how much it changed. Before Generation 4, every move's classification as physical or special was determined entirely by its type. Water moves were always special. Normal moves were always physical. A Pokemon's strength in battle was therefore partly determined by what type it happened to be, rather than by how its individual statistics were actually distributed. The split changed all of that. From Generation 4 onward, each individual move carries its own physical or special classification independent of type. This meant that Pokemon whose strongest statistics had always been misaligned with the moves they could learn suddenly had new possibilities. Absol is a Dark-type Pokemon with enormous physical attack and very little special attack, and before the split it had almost no good Dark-type moves to use, because Dark-type moves were classified as special. After the split, it suddenly had access to Night Slash, a physical Dark-type move that could make full use of what Absol was actually built to do. Flareon had existed since Generation 1 as an essentially novelty Pokemon because it had high physical attack and almost no physical fire-type moves to use. The split acknowledged this imbalance, even if it could not fully correct it. The depth this added to team building was significant. Players now had to think not just about what type a Pokemon was, but about which category of moves it would be using, and whether its statistics aligned with those moves. Opponents required more careful reading. A Gengar might threaten with special ghost-type attacks, or surprise with physical options it had never been able to use effectively before. The battles themselves became more layered, and the competitive scene that was beginning to take shape around Generation 4's online features benefited enormously from the added complexity. The underground was an entirely separate space beneath the surface of Sinnoh, accessible from almost anywhere in the region through an item called the Explorer Kit. Tunnels ran beneath the entire map, connecting in irregular ways, and players could dig into the walls of those tunnels to find fossils and evolution stones and the decorative items used to furnish secret bases. The bases themselves could be established in excavated pockets in the tunnel walls, customized with furniture and statues, visited by other players who traveled the same underground space. Players could plant traps in the tunnels leading toward their base, and there was a flag that could be captured and carried back to an opponent's base, and the whole thing had the character of a game existing inside the game. What made the underground feel genuinely special rather than just mechanically interesting was how it took the quiet social dimension of Pokemon and made it physical and spatial. You were not just trading or battling with another player. You were sharing a place with them. The tunnels had a texture and a geography, and moving through them with a friend meant navigating something together rather than simply exchanging information across a connection. For players who had access to friends with the same game, it became the place where hours disappeared. Mining together, stealing each other's flags, decorating bases, returning to the surface with pockets full of rare finds. The global trade system, introduced in Diamond and Pearl, was one of the most ambitious things the series had attempted at that point. The Pokemon Center in every town in Sinnoh contains a lower floor dedicated to wireless and online connections, and within that space sits a terminal that connects to a global network where players can deposit Pokemon for trade and specify what they would like in return. A player in one country could deposit a Pokemon they had easily and request something they needed, and a player somewhere else entirely could fulfill that request without either player needing to arrange anything directly. The trades simply happened, matching requests across the network. The online battle features ran alongside this, allowing players to challenge trainers from around the world in real time over the Nintendo Wi-Fi connection. For many players, this was the first time they had experienced online play in a Pokémon game, and the novelty of it, combined with the depth that the physical and special split had added to battle mechanics, meant that a serious competitive community began forming around these games in a way that had not quite happened before. People started thinking carefully about the mechanics in new ways. Strategies that had always existed in theory became possible to test against real opponents at scale. The Pokémon contest system returned in Generation 4, having first appeared in Generation 3's Hoenn games. In Sinnoh, it was expanded and made slightly more elaborate, with contest halls available in multiple cities and a competitive structure that rewarded players who invested time in preparing their Pokémon's appeal and move performances. The Super Contests in Diamond and Pearl added a dance round to the formula, asking players to match button inputs in rhythm with other contestants in a way that made the system feel more active and engaging than it had previously. Ribbons earned through contests could be displayed, and a Pokémon that achieved the highest rank in all 5 contest categories earned a special ribbon that remained part of its record permanently. The Pokétch was the small smartwatch distributed near the beginning of the game in Jubilife City, and it sat on the bottom screen of the Nintendo DS throughout the entire adventure. Its face cycled through a collection of small applications that players could download by completing tasks or talking to particular people scattered across Sinnoh. Some of the applications were practically useful, displaying the current time, tracking the happiness of the Pokémon in the party, showing a map of the region, recording steps taken. Others were more playful, a digital sketchpad, a small counter, a display that showed the types of Pokémon in the party as colored dots. The dual-screen format of the Nintendo DS was one of the central things that shaped how Diamond and Pearl felt to play. The top screen displayed the action, the routes and towns and battles and cutscenes, and the bottom screen was given over to information and interaction in ways that felt genuinely useful rather than decorative. Looking at the map, accessing the Pokétch applications, navigating menus during underground exploration, all of it happened on that lower screen while the world of Sinnoh continued to exist visibly above. The design philosophy was one of keeping both screens relevant, and it largely succeeded. The handheld felt like a complete object while playing these games. The Sinnoh Pokémon League sits at the northern edge of the region after a journey through what the game calls Victory Road, a cave complex that requires the use of multiple travel techniques, including rock climb and strength and surf, to navigate fully. The Elite Four of Sinnoh each specialize in a different type, and they are among the more thoughtfully constructed Elite Four teams in the series. Aaron uses bug types and leads with Pokémon that can set up conditions and disrupt the player before his heavier hitters arrive. Bertha uses ground types and builds her team around physical bulk and reliable damage. Flint uses fire types, though the limited number of fire-type Pokémon in the regional Pokédex creates a situation where his team includes a few Pokémon that do not quite fit his type, an acknowledged weakness in the game's design. Lucian uses psychic types and builds toward his Galad with a careful layering of setup and disruption. And then there is Cynthia. Her team begins with Spiritomb, a ghost and dark type with no weaknesses under the normal type chart, a Pokémon that requires patience and careful planning to defeat rather than simply power. She follows this with Roserade, Gastrodon, Lucario, Melodic, and finally Garchomp, and the movement of the team from opener to closer tells a kind of story about escalating pressure and increasing stakes. She is polite during the battle. She comments on the player's choices, She never seems surprised. When her final Pokemon falls, she congratulates the player warmly and without any suggestion of disappointment, and the feeling that creates is one of having earned something genuine rather than simply having beaten a very hard obstacle. Pokemon Diamond introduced a new connectivity feature through the PAL Park, an area accessed in the post-game that allowed players to import Pokemon from the Game Boy Advance titles into Generation 4. The process was called migration, and it was a one-way exchange. Pokemon sent to Diamond and Pearl could not return to the GBA games they came from, which made the decision to migrate feel meaningful and slightly solemn. Players who had spent hundreds of hours building teams in Ruby, Sapphire, Emerald, Fire Red, or Leaf Green could bring those companions forward into the new generation, and the PAL Park itself was presented as a place where Pokemon from distant regions had been brought to live, a kind of comfortable preserve for creatures that had traveled far. The post-game content in Diamond and Pearl was more substantial than the immediate post-game content in most of the previous entries in the series. The Battle Zone Island, reached by ship from a port in Snow Point City, contains a full new set of routes, some rare Pokemon encounters, and the Battle Tower, a facility where players could engage in extended competitive challenges using rental Pokemon or their own trained team. The island also contained the means to encounter certain legendary Pokemon from previous generations, accessed through specific items or through completing particular tasks. Heatran, found in Stark Mountain at the end of a long and involved side story, was one of these encounters. Regigigas, the master of the three golems from Generation 3, was another, requiring the player to have brought those three golems forward through migration before the encounter could be initiated. The legendary Pokemon native to Sinnoh, outside of Dialga and Palkia, form one of the most elaborate groups in the series. The Lake Trio, Uxie, Mesprit, and Azelf each occupy one of three lakes distributed across the region, and each represents one of the gifts given to humanity in Sinnoh's founding mythology. They are small Pokemon with enormous eyes and serene expressions, and their battle music is among the most memorable in the game. Mesprit is special among them because it cannot be simply encountered and captured in the way the others can. When the player first enters Lake Verity and approaches Mesprit, it registers in the Pokédex and then flies away, and from that point it wanders across the Sinnoh overworld and must be tracked using a device called the Marking Map application on the Pokédex. Chasing Mesprit across Sinnoh, watching its marker on the map, adjusting routes to intercept it, adds a quality of pursuit to an encounter that the other two lakes do not require. Giratina is the third member of the Creation Trio, a counterpart to Dialga and Palkia in the mythology of Sinnoh, and in Diamond and Pearl it is found only in the Turnback Cave, a puzzle dungeon of rooms that shuffle and disorient the player as they attempt to reach its chamber. The design of Turnback Cave communicates something about Giratina's nature before the creature is even encountered. The cave does not want to be navigated cleanly. It resists. Finding the chamber in the center requires passing through a specific sequence of rooms in a particular pattern, and a player who fails to do this correctly will be returned to the entrance and must begin again. When Giratina finally appears, enormous and dark and draped in gold ribs and black wings, the feeling is one of having found something that was trying not to be found. The music of Diamond and Pearl was composed by Hitomi Sato, and it represents one of the most distinctive sonic identities of any game in the series. The Sinnoh roots have a quietness to them that other regions' music does not quite match. The town themes are often melodically simple, with harmonies that suggest depth beneath the surface without ever becoming overwhelming. The battle music is energetic where it needs to be and builds with the same patient rhythm that the rest of the game establishes. The legendary encounter themes carry a weight that feels proportional to the mythology they accompany. And the music that plays in the distortion world, which appears in Platinum but which the groundwork of Diamond and Pearl established, is among the most genuinely alien pieces of music in the series. The Galactic Veilstone building is the moment in the story where Team Galactic stops feeling like a collection of odd uniformed people and starts feeling like something with genuine reach and consequence. The building is enormous, and navigating it requires working through multiple floors while dealing with the fact that its warp panels and guard systems are designed to disorient and exhaust. Cyrus is found in the building, and the conversation the player has with him there is one of the most unsettling in the series, not because he threatens or shouts, but because he explains himself calmly and completely, and his explanation makes a terrible kind of internal sense. He is not cruel. He is simply finished with the entire concept of feeling. The commanders of Team Galactic are each distinct enough to leave impressions that outlast the specific encounters with them. Mars is aggressive and competitive, treating battle like a personal test. Jupiter is cold and professional, her contempt for everything around her delivered without emphasis. Saturn is the most ambivalent of the three, and the post-game of Platinum in particular suggests that his loyalty to Cyrus was never unconditional in the way the others appears to have been. These characters function as a kind of preview of the different shapes that disconnection can take. Mars is disconnected through aggression, Jupiter through contempt, Saturn through quiet doubt, and Cyrus through total withdrawal. The design of Dialga and Palkia is worth sitting with for a moment. Dialga is a steel blue creature built like something between a dinosaur and a machine, with a diamond formation at its chest that gives it the appearance of having been designed rather than born. It represents time, and something in its rigid construction supports that association, as though it is a creature that does not move casually, but deliberately, each motion considered and placed. Palkia is rounder and more organic in its lines, pearl pink and silver, with spheres set into its shoulders that suggest the compression of space into discrete points. Where Dialga feels architectural, Palkia feels almost sculptural. Holding the two of them in mind simultaneously suggests something about the different textures of time and space themselves. The Sinnoh Pokédex was smaller than the regional Pokédexes of previous generations, with 151 entries, and the distribution of types within it created certain imbalances that affected the experience of playing through the main game. Water types were represented generously, as they had been in Huen, but Sinnoh had less geographic justification for that choice, its ocean routes being no more prominent than its mountain and forest areas. Fire types were represented with startling scarcity, with only 2 complete evolutionary lines available before the postgame and the National Pokédex opened. This meant that players who wanted to use fire-type Pokémon were almost always using their starter choice of Chimchar or finding ways to work around the limitation. The starter Pokémon of Generation 4 present 3 distinct aesthetic and mechanical directions. Turtwig is a small grass type with a sprout growing from its head, evolving through Grotle into Torterra, a massive creature whose back has become a landscape, a tree, and rolling hills carried on the shell of a vast tortoise. Piplup is a water-type penguin, evolving through Prinplup into Empoleon, whose type combination of water and steel was new at the time, and whose design references and Arctic penguins crossed with something almost heraldic in its posture and its crown-like markings. Chimchar is a fire-type chimpanzee with a flame burning from its tail, evolving through Monferno into Infernape, a creature that draws heavily from imagery associated with the Monkey King of Chinese mythology, fast and fierce and carrying its fire like a signature. Infernape became one of the most used starter final forms in the generation, partly because of its versatility. It is a fire and fighting type, with high speed and high attack across both physical and special categories, meaning it could be built in multiple directions and remained effective against a wide variety of opponents. The physical and special split added flexibility to Infernape specifically because it had access to strong options on both sides of the divide. Turtwig's final form, Torterra, had an interesting counterpart argument in its favor, its grass and ground typing giving it a distinct defensive profile, but the coverage weaknesses that came with that combination made it more demanding to use effectively. Empoleon's steel typing gave it a remarkable number of resistances, but also came with significant weaknesses that required careful handling. The original Diamond and Pearl had a battle speed that became one of the most frequently cited criticisms of the games both at the time and in retrospect. The transition to three-dimensional graphics on the Nintendo DS hardware came with processing costs that manifested as small pauses at various points in battle, a brief delay before the health bar begins to drain after a successful hit, a moment of stillness after a Pokémon faints before the game moves on, a slight lag in the menus during double battles. None of these delays were enormous in isolation, but they were consistent and cumulative, and across the course of a full playthrough with hundreds of battles, they created a texture of slowness that players noticed even if they could not always name exactly what was causing it. Health bars in Diamond and Pearl drain at a rate tied to the number of frames displayed, rather than to a fixed time, which meant that as the player's Pokémon grew stronger and the hit point totals grew larger, watching a health bar drain from full to empty took longer than it had in earlier stages of the game. This was not a design choice so much as a hardware constraint, and later games on more powerful hardware resolved it, but in the original Diamond and Pearl it contributed meaningfully to the feeling of certain late-game battles being slower and more laborious than they should have been. HMs, the hidden machine, moves that allowed Pokémon to interact with environmental obstacles, were present in every generation before Diamond and Pearl, but Generation 4 represented their peak in terms of both number and necessity. 8 HMs existed in Diamond and Pearl, and of those 8, 6 were either essential for completion of the main story or essentially required for comfortable exploration of the region. This meant that a player who wanted to be able to access all areas of Sinnoh without significant inconvenience needed to have Pokémon in their party or in their readily accessible storage that knew Surf, Fly, Strength, Rock Climb, Defog, and either Cut or Rock Smash. Defog was widely considered the most unreasonable of Generation 4's HMs. It had a predecessor in Flash from earlier generations, a move that reduced accuracy and could technically be avoided by a player willing to tolerate reduced accuracy in battles within certain caves. Defog's function was similar in concept, clearing fog from certain routes that would otherwise reduce the accuracy of all Pokémon participating in battles on those routes by a fixed percentage. But unlike Flash, the fog it was clearing could not be navigated around through memorization or patience in any practical sense, because the accuracy penalty applied to both the player's Pokémon and to wild Pokémon and trainer Pokémon alike, meaning that battles in foggy areas became exercises in watching both sides miss attacks repeatedly. The Sinnoh region routes that required rock climb were numerous and spread across the map, and the HM itself was obtained late enough in the game that many of those routes had been seen but could not be fully explored until the player backtracked with the newly acquired ability. This created a kind of deferred reward structure where areas spotted earlier became fully available later, and there was something satisfying in that pattern. Finding a high ledge on a route in the middle of the game and knowing that returning later would reveal what was there gave those areas a quality of promise that influenced how the player thought about Sinnoh as a whole. The reward of Rock Climb was that it made the entire region more complete. Platinum was released in Japan in September 2008 and in North America in March 2009, roughly 2 years after Diamond and Pearl, and it was received as a substantial improvement over its predecessors in almost every area that the original games had been criticized. The story of Platinum centers Giratina more prominently, allowing the third legendary of the creation trio to become an active participant in the events of the main plot rather than a hidden encounter found only in a late-game dungeon. Team Galactic's plan in Platinum involves summoning both Dialga and Palkia simultaneously at Spear Pillar rather than only one, and the larger scale of this event is what draws Giratina from its dimension to intervene. The Distortion World, Giratina's domain accessible only in Platinum, is one of the most genuinely strange environments in the series. It is presented as a space where the normal rules of physics do not apply, where the player can walk along walls and ceilings, where gravity seems to choose its own direction from moment to moment. The visual design is dominated by purple and black and floating geometry, platforms of stone suspended without visible support, cascades of water falling in directions that should not produce cascades. It feels like somewhere that should not exist, and that is aware of not existing, and has arranged itself accordingly around that awareness. Giratina moves through the Distortion World with complete ease, at home in a place where nothing behaves predictably. Platinum made significant adjustments to the regional Pokédex, addressing some of the type imbalances that had made Diamond and Pearl more limiting. The fire type selection in particular was expanded, giving players who wanted to build teams around fire types more options before the postgame opened up the national Pokédex. Gym leaders and Elite Four members had their teams adjusted, and many of the changes resulted in more interesting battles with teams that felt better aligned with their leader's type and strategy. Cynthia's team was unchanged in its members, but adjusted in its held items and movesets, making the champion battle one of the more precisely tuned encounters in the series. The Poketch gained new applications in Platinum, and the town map application, in particular, became more useful with the addition of Pokémon wandering the overworld. Certain legendary Pokémon in Platinum roam across Sinnoh, and tracking them on the Poketch map while adjusting routes to intercept them reproduce the feeling that the Mesprit chase in Diamond and Pearl had created but extended it to additional creatures. Manaphy, Cresselia, and others could be found wandering the region this way, their positions updating each time the player moved to a different route, creating a sustained side activity of patient pursuit that fit the rhythm of Sinnoh's pacing perfectly. The Battle Frontier added to Platinum in place of the simpler Battle Tower of Diamond, and Pearl represented a significant expansion of the endgame competitive content. The Battle Frontier was a concept that had appeared in Emerald, the third version of Generation 3, and its return in Platinum was welcomed by players who had spent considerable time with Emerald's version and wanted to see how the new generation's mechanics would translate into extended competitive challenges. The Frontier consists of 5 facilities, each with its own rules, its own structure, and its own brain, a particularly powerful trainer who serves as the final challenge of each facility at the highest metal tier. The Battle Tower is the most straightforward of the 5 facilities, asking the player to assemble a team and win consecutive battles against increasingly difficult opponents. The tower provides a baseline of difficulty and a clear structure, and it serves as the entry point for players coming to the Battle Frontier for the first time. The Battle Tower brain is Palmer, who is notable for being the father of Barry, the player's rival from the main game. His appearance as a Frontier brain adds a layer to Barry's characterization, suggesting where some of Barry's intensity and competitiveness comes from, while also showing a version of that energy that has been refined and directed over many years. The Battle Factory in Platinum operates similarly to the version that appeared in Emerald, presenting the player with a selection of rental Pokémon and asking them to build a team from those options before each set of battles begins. The rental Pokémon change, and the player can swap Pokémon with defeated opponents, gradually assembling a stronger team as the challenge continues. The Battle Factory rewards adaptability and broad knowledge of Pokémon movesets and capabilities rather than a single practice strategy applied repeatedly, because the Pokémon available are different each time, and the player cannot rely on the same combination across multiple runs. The Factory Brain in Platinum is Thornton, who uses information about the player's own team to select his own Pokémon, a mechanic that creates a strange mirror effect in the encounter. The Battle Hall asks the player to bring a single Pokémon and face opponents of chosen types in sequence, building a streak across all 18 types. The design of the hall centers on understanding how a single Pokémon's strengths and weaknesses interact with the full type chart, and choosing which types to face early in a streak versus later becomes a significant strategic consideration. A player using a Dragon-type Pokémon might choose to face Ice-type opponents early, before the difficulty scaling has increased enough to make Ice-type attacks a reliable threat, rather than encountering them later when the opposing Pokémon have more powerful moves and better statistics. The Hall Brain is Argenta, who uses a randomly selected team, making her encounter less predictable than some of the other Frontier Brains. The Battle Arcade presents the player with a roulette board before each battle that determines what conditions will affect the upcoming fight. Roulette results might cause weather conditions, give status ailments to Pokémon on either side, adjust held items, or produce other effects. The timing of the roulette press can influence which result lands, and with practice, a player can reliably land on favorable outcomes in the early stages of a streak when the board has more beneficial options available. This sense of agency within what appears to be a system of chance gives the arcade a particular quality, the feeling of reading a pattern and acting on it, rather than simply reacting to whatever happens. The arcade brain is Dahlia, who is one of the more memorable Frontier Brains in terms of presentation. The Battle Castle is the facility that adds resource management to the competitive structure most explicitly. Players earn castle points through battle performance, and those points can be spent on healing, on viewing information about upcoming opponents, and on renting better held items for Pokémon before encounters. The decisions about when to spend points and what to spend them on become as important as the battles themselves. A player who heals between every battle will have healthy Pokémon but limited information and fewer strategic options. A player who saves points aggressively to purchase access to premium held items will have powerful tools available, but must succeed in battles with potentially injured Pokémon. Darok, the castle's butler, fights in place of the Lady Caitlin, making his own team a careful and specific challenge rather than a random assembly. Caitlin herself went on to appear as a member of the Elite Four in Pokémon Black and White, making the Battle Castle the first place players encountered her, even if she never battled there. Darok's presence as her representative added an interesting dimension to the castle's narrative, suggesting a relationship between the two characters that the castle's framing text gestured toward without fully explaining. These small suggestions of worlds existing outside the immediate experience of the player were one of the things that Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum handled particularly well, the sense that Sinnoh contained more than could be fully seen from within the bounds of a single playthrough. The Grand Underground in the remakes, Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, expanded significantly on the original Underground from Diamond and Pearl, adding biome-specific rooms called Pokémon Hideaways, where wild Pokémon from across the National Pokédex could be encountered. This addition addressed one of the original game's most consistent criticisms by making a broader range of Pokémon available during the main game. The original underground's purposes of mining and secret base construction remained, but the Pokemon hideaways added a dimension that transformed the underground from a primarily social feature into a feature with direct implications for team building and Pokedex completion during the main story. The Pokemon Platinum logo, cast in silver and featuring the silhouette of Giratina's origin form, communicated something about the game's intent before anyone had played it. Where Diamond showed Dialga and Pearl showed Palkia in their full colors, Platinum's Giratina was rendered in cool silver, suggesting a kind of negative space, something that exists in the gaps between the other two rather than alongside them as an equal. The origin form of Giratina, accessible in the distortion world and in other areas when the player holds a particular item, is longer and more sinuous than the altered form that appears in Diamond and Pearl's Turnback Cave. Its 6 wings spread wide, its body a serpentine length of gold-banded black. It is genuinely one of the most striking Pokemon designs in the series. The mythology of Sinnoh extends through texts found in the Celestic ruins and through conversations with the elder who lives there, Cynthia's grandmother, who has dedicated her life to preserving and understanding the old stories. One of those stories describes the Pokemon world before anything in it existed, an emptiness and then a single egg appearing in that emptiness, and from the egg hatching something that immediately began the work of making everything else. The story does not describe this being as powerful or frightening. It describes it as working, as filling emptiness with structure and life, and then resting when the work was done. Arceus, when encountered, is a quiet Pokemon compared to what its mythology implies. Cream-colored and tall, marked with a ring of gold, it looks almost humble for something that supposedly made everything. The hidden ruins of Alph in Generation 2's Johto region had established a precedent for mysterious environments connected to Unhurried, but Sinnoh's relationship with those letter-form Pokemon was developed further. The ruins at Selacion allow players to encounter many unknown forms, and completing the unknown alphabet in the Pokédex unlocks certain items. The unknown themselves cannot be used in battle in any particularly effective way, their move pool being limited to a single attack, and this limitation seems almost intentional, as though the games are acknowledging that some things are not meant for combat. The unknown exists to be observed and collected and thought about, a collection of questions shaped like an ancient language. The sound design of Diamond and Pearl contributed to the region's atmosphere in ways that complemented the music. Roots had ambient sounds, the rustle of tall grass, the cry of wild Pokemon heard before they were seen, the particular noise of rain in the areas where weather affected roots. The cry of each Pokemon in Generation 4 was rendered with slightly more fidelity than the compressed sounds of the GBA games, and the transition to DS hardware meant that sound could be used with somewhat more nuance. The eerie silence of certain late-game areas, like the chamber before the Giratina encounter in Turnback Cave, used the absence of ambient sound as a deliberate choice, the quiet itself communicating something about where the player was and what was about to happen. The Pokemon contests were not the only form of social activity built into Diamond and Pearl's world. The Pokemon Amity Square in Hearthome City allowed players to walk their Pokemon in a park setting, the creature following behind the player character as they explored the enclosed area. Only certain Pokemon were permitted in the square, those considered cute enough by the game's standards, and the experience of walking a Pokemon through that space had no mechanical function but felt meaningful in a way that was difficult to quantify. It was simply a place to spend a few minutes with a creature you had been traveling with, in a context that had nothing to do with battle or collection or progression. Hearthome City itself was one of the more architecturally distinct cities in the region. Its church is a substantial building at the city's center with a wide plaza in front of it, and characters in the game mention it without providing complete information about what is practiced there, leaving the question open. The contest hall is adjacent to the main walking paths, its presence suggesting that the city considers artistic performance a central part of its identity rather than a peripheral attraction. Fantina, the city's gym leader, uses ghost types and runs the contest hall in addition to her gym duties, and she speaks with an accent that the game represents through particular word choices that suggest she came to Sinnoh from somewhere else and brought customs with her. The bicycle in Diamond and Pearl was one of the quality of life features that slightly offset the slower pace of the games. Routes that would have been tedious to traverse on foot became much more manageable when the player could switch to the bicycle and move at higher speed through the tall grass. The music changed when riding the bicycle, a faster and more urgent arrangement of the route theme playing while the player moved quickly through familiar terrain. The bicycle was not available from the beginning of the game, obtained instead through a fairly early trade of an old rod at the bicycle shop in Eterna City, and the transition from walking to biking in the game's early hours marked a meaningful shift in how easily the player could move between areas. Super contests in Hardhome City involved multiple rounds, and the strategy for winning involved understanding which category of contest a given Pokémon performed best in, having a move with high appeal in that category, and coordinating with other participants. The 4 competing Pokémon in a super contest are controlled partly by the AI and partly by the player, and the dancing round, where timed button inputs determine the level of excitement generated, rewarded practice and attention. A Pokémon that won all 5 contest categories at the Master rank received a special ribbon called the Contest Memory Ribbon, and collecting ribbons for a single Pokémon across generations and games became a dedicated side activity for some players. The Pokémon in the Sinnoh regional Pokédex that are associated with water number more than a dozen across full evolutionary lines, and some players found this imbalance jarring, given that Sinnoh's geography is not particularly more ocean-heavy than previous regions. The abundance of water types meant that encounters in many areas of the game had a predictable quality, and players building teams without a focus on water types still needed at least one to use Surf, creating a situation where water types occupied a mandatory slot in most parties for at least part of the game. The inclusion of Pokémon like Gyarados and Melodic, which had already featured heavily in previous generations, alongside the new water type options, further densified an already well-represented type category. Volkner, the 8th gym leader, uses electric types, and his team includes Pokémon that are not electric types, because the regional Pokédex simply did not provide enough electric type options for him to fill his roster with creatures that matched his specialty. He has an Octillery, a water type, and an Ambipom, a normal type, both given electric type moves to loosely justify their inclusion. The fact that this approach was necessary is a reflection of how the type distribution in the regional Pokédex failed certain leaders. Volkner is not the only example, but he is the most prominent, because his position as the final gym leader makes his team's inconsistency more noticeable than it would be for an earlier challenger. Flint, the Elite Four member specializing in fire types, faces the same problem with even more severity. His team in Diamond and Pearl includes Drifblim, Lopunny, and Steelix, alongside the expected fire types, all given fire-type moves in an attempt to maintain thematic consistency. None of those 3 Pokémon are fire types, and none of them are primarily designed around fire-type attacks, meaning Flint's team has a cobbled-together quality that undermines what should be a particularly memorable encounter. In Platinum, these teams were revised when possible, but the underlying constraint of a regional Pokédex with very few fire types could not be entirely overcome without changing the Pokédex itself. Gardenia, the second gym leader, uses grass types, and her team in Diamond and Pearl is notably well constructed given the options available to her. Her Roserade carries the weight of the encounter, and preparing for it requires either understanding the fire type weakness or accepting that the battle will be extended and methodical. Maylene, the third gym leader, uses fighting types, and her Lucario serves a similar function, a Pokémon whose capabilities can surprise a player who has not thought carefully about how to approach it. Byron, the sixth gym leader, uses steel types, and his team has an interesting defensive texture, each member presenting a slightly different set of challenges, rather than simply repeating the same approach in different Pokémon. The pacing of Diamond and Pearl's story in terms of narrative beats was generally considered well managed, with the time between significant events feeling appropriate and the distractions and side content available between gyms providing genuine variety. The larger criticism was mechanical rather than structural, the speed of the game itself rather than the spacing of its story. Routes between towns were interesting. Mount Coronet's multiple entrances and interior passages created a complex internal geography that rewarded exploration and occasionally surprised players who had passed through the mountain before without examining every corner. The Pokémon Mansion east of Hardham housed a wealthy collector whose rooms full of Pokémon-themed furniture suggested a life organized entirely around the Pokémon hobby. Professor Rowan is the professor of the Sinnoh region and presents himself differently from most of the regional professors that had come before him. He is older, his white hair and heavy coat suggesting decades of outdoor research in cold weather, and he is more formal and somewhat more intimidating than his counterparts in other regions. He does not immediately give the impression of someone who will explain everything patiently and at length. He gives the impression of someone who expects you to figure things out for yourself, who regards the Pokémon world as genuinely serious business rather than a casual hobby. His relationship with Lucas, or Dawn, the player character depending on which version the player selected, has a quality of mentorship that feels earned rather than simply assigned. Dawn or Lucas as the player character are among the more visually distinctive designs for a player character in the series up to that point. The outfit for the female player character in particular, with its distinctive white hat and pink accents, became iconic enough to represent the generation in multiple later contexts. The player characters of Diamond and Pearl look like they belong to a region that takes weather seriously. Their clothes, practical for the cold mountain climate, without sacrificing the visual distinctiveness that made them immediately recognizable. Route 209 leads south from Hearthome City and includes both the Hallowed Tower, where the odd keystone can be used to summon Spiritomb after talking to underground players, and the Lost Tower, a small building housing the gravestones of Pokémon that have passed away and populated by ghost types. The presence of those two locations on the same route creates a particular atmospheric quality for a relatively short stretch of path. The Hallowed Tower requires social interaction to use, connecting the summoning of a legendary Pokémon to the underground system and the presence of other players. The Lost Tower requires nothing but the willingness to walk its floors and face the gentle sadness of what it represents. Spiritomb, obtained through the Hallowed Tower method, is a Pokémon with no weakness under the normal type chart of Generation 4. It is a ghost and dark type, and those two types together neutralize each other's weaknesses completely, because ghost types are not effective against dark types, and dark types are not effective against ghost types. Defeating Spiritomb in a vanilla Diamond or Pearl game requires patience and moves that can chip away at its substantial defenses without any particular type advantage to accelerate the process. It was one of the most talked about defensive Pokemon of the generation, and Cynthia's decision to lead her team with one was part of what made her first encounter feel so well considered. The Pokemon Association in Sinnoh, the governing body that oversees Pokemon contests and coordinates with the League, has a presence in the game through characters who appear to handle registration and administration, and their existence adds a layer to the world's infrastructure that earlier games had not quite articulated. Sinnoh feels like a place with functioning institutions, with organizations that have existed for some time and that understand their roles. This institutional texture extends to Team Galactic itself, which occupies an actual headquarters building in Veilstone City, complete with a storage warehouse and a publicly visible facade, suggesting an organization that has managed to exist within the region's legal framework, even while pursuing goals that would unravel everything. Manaphy, the Pokemon central to the Pokemon Ranger games that released alongside Diamond and Pearl, could be obtained through a mystery gift distribution or by completing a mission in Pokemon Ranger and transferring the egg to Diamond or Pearl. Hatching a Manaphy egg in Diamond and Pearl and watching it emerge as a small blue sea creature was one of the more memorable cross-game experiences of the generation. Phione, which could be bred from Manaphy, occupied an ambiguous status in official materials for years, some documents listing it as legendary and others suggesting it was not because it could be bred in large quantities in a way that conventional legendary Pokemon could not be. The visual design of Sinnoh's towns reflects the regional mythology in subtle architectural choices. Celestic Town's buildings are older than those in most other settlements, their construction suggesting a community that built to last and then stopped building, content with what existed. Snow Point's few structures are low and robust, built for a climate that punishes anything fragile. Eterna's layout is organized around its central statue in a way that suggests the statue was there first and the city grew around it. These small design choices accumulate into a region that feels like it has been inhabited for a very long time by people who thought carefully about how to inhabit it. The Sinnoh ribbons, collectible decorations attached to a Pokemon's data through various activities, include several specific to Generation 4's features. Ribbons could be earned through contest victories at various ranks, through defeating certain frontier brains, through having a Pokemon blessed at particular locations, and through various other activities spread across the region. A Pokemon that had accumulated many ribbons from many different sources carried its history with it, the ribbons functioning as a record of what it had experienced and where it had been. Moving a Pokemon forward through later generations preserved its ribbons, and there are players who maintain Pokemon in current games that still carry ribbons earned in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum. The Pokemon Pokéradar, a key item obtained after becoming champion, allows the player to trigger encounters with specific Pokemon in patches of tall grass that shake in a pattern indicating which Pokemon is present. Using the Pokéradar requires moving carefully through the grass to maintain a chain, encountering the same Pokemon repeatedly without breaking the sequence, and as the chain grows longer, the probability of encountering a shiny Pokemon increases significantly. Shiny Pokemon, alternate color variants that appear rarely in normal gameplay, had existed since Generation 2, but the Pokéradar method gave players a structured way to pursue them. The discipline required to maintain a long Pokéradar chain, the careful movement, the avoidance of any disruption, made successful shiny encounters through this method feel particularly earned. The Generation 4 shiny rate outside of the Pokéradar was 1 in 8,192 encounters, meaning that finding a shiny Pokemon through ordinary encounters was an event rare enough that most players could complete the game many times without ever seeing one. When a shiny appeared, The sound effect of sparkling stars filled the otherwise ordinary encounter music, and the sight of a differently colored Pokémon preceded by that sound created a moment of complete surprise and delight that became a defining memory for many players of the generation. The Pokémon community still shares shiny encounter memories from Diamond and Pearl with a quality of nostalgia that speaks to how impactful those moments were when they happened. Cherubi and Cherrim represent one of the quieter design concepts in the Generation 4 Pokédex. Cherubi is a small round Pokémon with a smaller berry attached to its body, and it evolves based on conditions of sunlight, becoming Cherrim, which in sunny weather opens into a form with bright floral petals and a cheerful expression. In all other weather, Cherrim remains in its overcast form, smaller and more enclosed. The design is a gentle metaphor about how conditions affect presentation, and it fits the Sinnoh region's aesthetic of natural forms, reflecting deeper ideas. Cherrim was not one of the generation's most powerful Pokémon, but it was one of the most quietly thoughtful in its concept. Pachirisu, a small electric-type squirrel, occupied the role of regional electric rodent that the series had established with Pikachu and continued with Marill and Plusles and Minun, each generation producing a small, cute electric type that generated significant affection even if it was not particularly powerful in competitive terms. Pachirisu's white and blue coloring and its oversized tail made it one of the more visually distinctive entries in this informal tradition, and it gained renewed attention many years after the game's release, when a competitive player used it to win the World Championship in 2014, demonstrating that the game's mechanics contained possibilities that conventional wisdom had not fully explored. The location of the Pokémon League in Diamond and Pearl and the path through Victory Road that precedes it represents one of the more geographically interesting implementations of that standard structure in the series. Victory Road in Sinnoh is a cave system that requires the player to navigate multiple chambers using rock climb to scale walls and descend ledges, surf to cross internal bodies of water, and strength to move boulders that block passages. The effect is of a dungeon that tests not just the player's team's power, but their ability to navigate physical space, and the complexity of the cave's interior created a sense of arriving at the Pokémon League, having traveled through something, rather than simply walked to it. After the credits roll in Diamond and Pearl, the world opens in ways that had not been available during the main game. The National Pokédex becomes active, allowing encounters with Pokémon from all previous generations in specific areas of Sinnoh. The Battle Zone Island, previously inaccessible, becomes reachable by ship. The full extent of the postgame becomes clear as locations mentioned or hinted at during the main game reveal what they actually contain. Stark Mountain, found in the Battle Zone, houses Heatran at its depths, and reaching Heatran requires completing a sequence of events involving Buck, a trainer from the Battle Zone area, before the legendary Pokémon becomes accessible. The Island of the Fight, Survival, and Resort areas in the Battle Zone each have distinct characters. The Fight area is organized around the Battle Tower and serves as the competitive hub of the postgame. The Survival area presents routes populated with strong, wild Pokémon, where experienced trainers come to test themselves in more casual encounters. The Resort area is explicitly a vacation destination, its occupants relaxing in a way that suggests the rest of Sinnoh's population does not take vacations here, but that this island exists outside the normal flow of things. The contrast between the Fight area's competitive focus and the Resort area's deliberate leisure captures something about the postgame's design, offering both continued challenge and a space to simply exist. Everything about Diamond and Pearl came together in Platinum, and Platinum has the quality of a game that knows what it is doing. The city of Floaroma was retouched. The routes through Sinnoh were given additional encounters. The story was expanded in ways that added weight to moments that had felt slightly underwritten in the original games. The distortion world was added as a genuinely new environment that could not have been made without the thematic and mechanical foundation that Diamond and Pearl had established. The Battle Frontier arrived to give competitive players a structured reason to continue playing far beyond the post-game content of the originals, but it is the quiet moments of Diamond and Pearl, the moments before Platinum arrived to refine them, that remain most clearly present in the memories of players who experienced those games at the right time. The first time seeing Snow Point City through the blizzard, the first conversation with Cyrus in the Veilstone building, the first encounter with a roaming Mesprit appearing on the Poketch map, standing at the bottom of Spear Pillar and looking up at what the mythology said had happened there. These were not moments of spectacle so much as moments of atmosphere, of a world communicating something through how it looked and felt, rather than through what it said. The question the title asks, whether Diamond and Pearl are really that good, has an answer that is complicated and honest, and ultimately very personal. They are games with real weaknesses, systems that slowed the experience unnecessarily, a regional Pokédex that limited choices in ways that created frustration, an HM requirement that imposed costs on exploration that later generations proved were unnecessary. And they are also games of extraordinary atmosphere and genuine mythological depth, games that took the world of Pokémon seriously as a world and built it with care from the mythology outward. They are both things simultaneously, and the decision about whether that combination adds up to something great depends on what you bring to them. What they undeniably are is formative. For a generation of players who came to them at the exact right age, Diamond and Pearl are not games so much as places. Places they lived in for long stretches of time, places that gave them memories tied to people and seasons and times of day in the real world. The connections formed in those underground tunnels, the trades completed across oceans through the global trade station, the hours spent hunting for a particular Pokémon at the edge of a snowy route, these are not things that can be evaluated by looking at the game's systems in isolation. They are the product of a game and a player and a moment in time meeting each other in exactly the right way. Sinnoh is quiet and calm and slow and full of a past that its people carry forward with genuine reverence. Mount Coronet stands at its center, Spear Pillar at its peak, visible from everywhere. The mythology says the world began there, and the games never ask you to doubt it. They simply show you a cold and ancient mountain and let you stand at its base and feel the weight of everything it represents. That feeling of standing at the edge of something enormous and old is what Diamond and Pearl do best, and it is the thing that no criticism of their pacing or their Pokédex or their HMs can entirely undo. Sinnoh asked you to slow down and look at where you were, and if you did, it had something real to show you. These games will continue to live in the memories of everyone who walked their routes and stayed up late to complete one more battle and named their Infernape something they still remember now. The lost saves and the carried copies and the ribbons that have persisted through every subsequent migration are evidence of something that was genuinely loved, not despite its imperfections, but alongside them, the way you love a place that was yours at a particular time, and that will never be quite anyone else's in quite the same way. Sinnoh was not just a region. For a great many players, it was somewhere they grew up, and those years do not come back, but the games are still there, and the mountain is still visible from everywhere, and Spear Pillar is still waiting at the top if you are willing to make the climb. There is another quiet journey waiting for you just to the left of where you are now. Let it begin while you rest, and perhaps somewhere in the space between waking and sleep, you will find yourself walking a snowy route at the edge of a world where the past is never truly past, where everything that was made with intention, and where the gifts of emotion and knowledge and willpower are still being honored by people who never forgot why they were given. The Pokémon wireless communications features that Diamond and Pearl built around the Nintendo DS hardware were not limited to trading and battling. The Union Room in the Pokémon Center allowed nearby players to meet and interact in real time, a precursor to the more elaborate multiplayer spaces that later generations would develop. Walking into the Union Room with a friend meant seeing their trainer sprite moving around the same small space, and being able to initiate trades and battles directly from within that shared environment had a texture of immediacy that asynchronous trading through the GTS did not. The Union Room was where friendships were maintained between classmates, where specific Pokémon changed hands with a sense of ceremony that the global trade system, efficient and impersonal, could not replicate. The mystery gift system in Diamond and Pearl allowed players to receive special items and Pokémon through wireless distribution events, and some of the most memorable items distributed through this system were the Pokémon that unlocked access to legendary encounters in the game. The Azure Flute, which was planned for distribution but ultimately never officially released, would have allowed players to encounter Arceus at Spear Pillar through an ethereal staircase that appeared only when the item was used at that location. The flute was fully programmed into the game, and players who accessed it through unofficial means experienced the Spear Pillar Arceus encounter as it was designed, complete with unique music that played as the Pokémon descended the golden stairs. The decision not to release the Azure Flute through official channels remains one of the more intriguing distribution choices of the generation. The event distributions that were released added Pokémon like Darkrai and Shaman, both of which were catchable in Diamond and Pearl through elaborate sequences triggered by exclusive items. Darkrai, obtainable through the member card distributed at particular events, required the player to check into a hotel room in Kanalav City and fall asleep, entering a nightmare landscape called New Moon Island, where the Pokémon waited in the fog. The sequence, though, has a particular quality, its presentation treating the encounter with a gravity appropriate to a Pokémon whose entire design concept involves inducing nightmares. Shaman, obtainable through the Oak's letter distribution, involved Professor Oak appearing at the southern end of Route 224 and inscribing a message at a stone marker, causing a path of flowers to bloom leading to Flower Paradise. These event-gated encounters gave Diamond and Pearl a structure where the complete experience of the game was not entirely contained within the cartridge, but extended outward into the real world, into physical locations where distributions were held, and into the social networks that passed information about how to obtain items and Pokémon. This extended texture was part of what made the era feel participatory in a particular way. Being part of the Pokémon community in 2006 and 2007 meant being part of something that was happening, that was releasing new content and creating shared experiences across a community of players who communicated through forums and school hallways and neighborhood conversations simultaneously. The Pokémon musical feature did not exist in Diamond and Pearl, but appeared in the Generation 5 games that followed, representing one direction in which the contest system's underlying concept of performing rather than battling was taken. The contests in Diamond and Pearl remained one of the most fully realized implementations of that idea in the series, offering a complete parallel activity to the gym challenge with its own rankings, its own locations, its own community of dedicated trainers, and its own system of preparation and strategy. A player who wanted to win master rank contests in all 5 categories had to think carefully about which moves their Pokemon knew, which accessories were available, and how the appeal and excitement mechanics interacted. The accessories used in Super Contests in Diamond and Pearl could be collected through various means, including exchanges at the Veilstone department store, gifts from other players in the Underground, and rewards from completing activities in the contest system itself. Building a collection of accessories and selecting the right combination for a particular Pokemon's performance in a given category became a secondary layer of preparation that engaged a different kind of thinking than battle preparation required. Some players found this system more appealing than the battle mechanics themselves, and the contest halls in Hardhome and other cities were consistently busy environments that felt alive with activity, distinct from what the gym circuit offered. Looker is a character from the International Police who appears in Diamond and Pearl as part of an investigation into Team Galactic's activities. His appearances are scattered throughout the story, usually arriving slightly after events have already occurred, having been tracking the same thread the player has been following, but from a different angle. He is good-natured and slightly bumbling, his persistence more endearing than impressive, and his presence adds a layer to the world of Sinnoh that suggests the region's events are being monitored by forces beyond the immediate participants. Looker went on to appear in subsequent Pokémon games, becoming one of the series' recurring non-player characters across multiple regions and connecting the stories of different generations through his continued investigations. The cultural references embedded in Sinnoh's mythology and design draw from multiple Japanese traditions in ways that create a layered experience for players familiar with those traditions while remaining coherent for players who are not. The Lake Trio's connection to knowledge, emotion, and willpower echoes Buddhist philosophical concepts that appear repeatedly in Japanese cultural contexts. The design of the Lake Trio Pokémon themselves, with their humanoid faces and their quality of ancient calm, suggests something more like guardians from religious iconography than the animal-inspired creatures that populate much of the regional Pokédex. The creation mythology involving Arceus draws from creation stories present in various world traditions while remaining specific enough to feel like it belongs to a particular place and culture. Geibel, found in a small cave accessible only by using the bicycle on a specific slope in Wayward Cave, is one of the more deliberately obscured Pokémon encounters in the generation. Wayward Cave is a dark cave requiring flash or careful navigation without it, and the hidden section containing Gible is reached through an entrance beneath a bridge that many players miss entirely. Gible's presence there reflects a design choice about creating discovery through careful exploration rather than ensuring that every Pokémon is accessible through obvious means. A player who finds Gible without a guide experiences a particular kind of satisfaction, the feeling of having looked where others did not and been rewarded for the attention. Gible evolves into Gabite and then Garchomp, meaning that a player who finds and trains one early enough can have one of the most powerful Pokémon in the game long before it would normally appear. The Pokémon found exclusively in Diamond and those found exclusively in Pearl created a version difference structure that had been part of the series since its inception, but took on a particular character in Generation 4 because the version-exclusive Pokémon were in some cases dramatic enough to affect team composition significantly. Diamond players had access to Dialga and certain other Pokémon that Pearl players did not, and Pearl players had Palkia and their own exclusives. The tradition of trading between versions to complete the Pokédex was maintained, and the differences between the two versions were sufficient to give each one a distinct character, while remaining functionally similar in terms of game structure and story. The name Dialga is interpreted by some Pokémon scholars as combining the Japanese word for time with another element suggesting something that comes before. Palkia's name carries a similar dual reference. Its syllables, echoing Japanese terminology related to space and dimension. These naming choices reflect a design approach in which the names of Pokémon carry meaning for Japanese speakers that may not fully translate to other languages, but that adds a layer of intentionality to the design for those who can read it. The way the games handle the mythology of these two Pokémon treats their names as essentially self-explanatory to anyone who understands the linguistic roots, which is consistent with how Sinnoh treats its mythology generally, as something available to those willing to look carefully. The battle tower facilities and the competition structures built around them in Generation 4 represented one of the most sophisticated implementations of extended competitive content in the series to that point. The concept of the battle tower had appeared in Crystal and later in Emerald, each iteration refining the formula of consecutive battles against increasingly difficult opponents with limited resources and a persistent streak that ended upon defeat. The stakes in Diamond and Pearl's battle tower were different from the story stakes of the main game, the only thing lost on defeat being the streak itself and the opportunity to continue earning battle points. But the emotional investment in maintaining a long streak was often more intense than what the story battles produced. The economic system of battle points in the post-game competitive facilities created a sustained engagement loop that kept players returning to the battle zone long after the story was complete. Points earned through the tower and in Platinum, the frontier could be exchanged for rare technical machines, evolution items, and held items that were either unavailable or extremely difficult to obtain elsewhere. The Scarf items, which boosted a Pokemon's highest stat at the cost of limiting it to one move, were available through the Battle Tower exchange, and their utility in competitive play made them objects worth grinding for. The Macho Brace and power items for accelerating effort value training were similarly accessible through competitive facility points, tying the competitive endgame content to the progression systems that defined long-term team building. The way Diamond and Pearl handled legendaries outside of the Creation Trio and the Lake Trio included several encounters that required completing specific in-game tasks rather than simply finding a hidden location. Heatran's encounter in Stark Mountain was preceded by a collaboration with Buck, a trainer who accompanies the player through the mountain and takes the Magma Stone before the final chamber, requiring the player to retrieve it before the legendary becomes available. This sequence added a brief narrative context to the encounter that gave Heatran a slightly different quality than a Pokémon found simply by walking into a cave. Someone had been there before, something had been disturbed, and needed to be set right before the Pokémon at the mountain's heart would appear. The Snow Point Temple, sealed at the beginning of the game and opened only after a specific event involving a Regigigas transfer from a Generation 3 game, housed Regigigas in its deepest chamber. Regigigas is the largest of the Regis, a creature of woven grassy fibers and ancient stone that the mythology says once pulled the continents into their current positions. Its ability, Slow Start, severely reduces its attack and speed for the first 5 turns of any battle, creating a Pokémon that is theoretically extremely powerful but requires sustained setup to reach that potential. This design choice was interpreted by some as a deliberate creative statement, a Pokémon that cannot simply be unleashed but must first be allowed to wake up, its power arriving slowly and then arriving with considerable force. Regis, Regirock, and Registeel could be migrated from Pokémon Emerald, where they were obtainable through a sequence involving specific patterns of navigation through various ruins, and their presence in the Pokémon storage when visiting the Snow Point Temple was what triggered Regigigas' encounter. The transfer of these 3 Pokémon from one game to another, carrying them forward into a new generation to unlock something that could not be accessed without them, created a continuity of investment across games. A player who had caught the Regis in Emerald and brought them forward was being rewarded not just for playing Diamond or Pearl, but for having played the games that came before, the berry growing system was simplified compared to its implementation in Generation 3, where berries grew on specific plots that required attention over real-world time. In Diamond and Pearl, berries were planted in designated spots on roots and grew at predictable rates, with the Pokéch's Berry Checker application allowing players to monitor the status of their plantings without traveling to each location. Berries with competitive applications, the ones that reduced damage from super effective hits of particular types, or that restored health under certain conditions, required deliberate cultivation and planning to have an adequate supply. Players who invested in the berry system and learned which berries grew from which plots and how to maximize yields had access to held item options that players who ignored the system did not. The move tutors in Platinum specifically added a set of moves that had previously been available only through Pokémon Emerald, creating options for Generation 4 competitive players that Diamond and Pearl alone had not provided. Moves like Vacuum Wave, an instant priority fighting type attack, and Endeavor, which reduced an opponent's health to match the user's remaining health, became available through shards exchanged with tutors on the Battle Frontier Island. These moves opened new competitive strategies and created new team composition possibilities that changed the metagame in ways that are still discussed by players interested in the competitive history of the generation. What Diamond and Pearl and Platinum ultimately contributed to the series was a coherent vision of a Pokémon region as a place with genuine mythology, genuine history, and genuine people who lived by values derived from that history. Sinnoh is not simply a backdrop for the trainer's journey. It is a place that has been thinking about itself for a very long time, that has worked out what it believes about the world, and that embodies those beliefs in how it is built and how its people behave. The games ask the player to take Sinnoh seriously, to pay attention to the texts in the ruins and the sayings of the towns and the conversations of the people who live there, because all of those things together form a picture of a world that has a reason to exist beyond providing locations for gym battles. That seriousness is what gives Diamond and Pearl their particular weight in the memories of the players who came to them at the right time. They were games that treated the player as someone capable of understanding something complicated, that did not explain everything and did not need to, that trusted the mythology to do its work without constant intervention. In a series that had by that point already produced 6 major main series games, the decision to go deeper rather than wider, to build a smaller Pokédex with more carefully chosen contents, and to anchor the narrative in creation mythology rather than simply in the conflict between protagonist and antagonist, was a meaningful creative choice. Not every player responded to it, but the ones who did found something in Sinnoh that no other region had quite offered, and they have not forgotten it since. The gentle weight of all that history, the cold mountain air and the sound of snow settling on rooftops in Snow Point, the sight of Spear Pillar through the blizzard at the summit, the quiet of a lake with something ancient and calm watching from beneath the water. These things do not diminish with time. They wait, as Sinnoh has always waited, patient and unhurried, for someone to slow down and notice them. The past lives here. It always did. The Hearthome City Gym, led by Fantina, is the only gym in the core series that the player can reach before they have the badge required to fight it. Arriving in Hearthome City, after coming south from Eterna, the gym is visible and the city invites exploration, but Fantina is away when the player first arrives, participating in a Pokémon contest, as she apparently does regularly. Returning later, after collecting the badges that unlock access to Hearthome from the other side, allows the player to challenge the gym, and the experience of having seen the city and passed through it before being able to face its leader adds a quality of anticipation that straightforward progression would not produce. Fantina herself uses a team of ghost types with the Mismagus as her ace, and the gym's puzzle involves memorizing the answers to dance steps displayed in sequence, which fits her dual role as contest performer and gym leader. The Pokémon available on each route in Sinnoh were generally tailored to fit the geographic character of the route. Snow-capped routes in the north held ice types and the cold-adapted evolutions of creatures found elsewhere. The routes leading into and through Mount Coronet held rock and ground and steel types that suggested creatures shaped by stone and geology. The forest routes had their bug and grass and normal types, and the water routes had their familiar mix of aquatic Pokémon that appeared again and again throughout the region. This ecological consistency, while it contributed to the sense that some types were over or underrepresented, also made the world feel like it had been designed with an understanding of what kinds of creatures would naturally occupy which kinds of environments. The Pal Park encounter mechanic, after migrating Pokémon from Game Boy Advance titles, involved not a traditional battle, but a catching game where the player ran through the park and used special park balls to catch the migrated Pokémon, which behaved like wild encounters, but with guaranteed capture after a successful throw. The park balls had a catch rate that made the process straightforward, and the main challenge was finding the migrated Pokémon within the park's areas, which were divided into ecological zones. Meeting a Pokémon that had been raised in Emerald or Fire Red and catching it again in Diamond or Pearl had a particular emotional quality, like reuniting with something after a journey. Everything about the generation encouraged this kind of sustained relationship with specific Pokémon. The friendship mechanics that had existed since Generation 2, tracking how much a Pokémon liked its trainer based on interactions and care and time spent together, had become more embedded in the experience through features like Amity Square and the friendship-based evolutions that several new Generation 4 Pokémon required. Togekiss, Lucario, and others would only evolve under conditions tied to a Pokémon's happiness, meaning that raising them required not just leveling, but attention. Walking with them, using them in battles they could win, giving them items and vitamins, gradually building toward the moment the relationship had deepened enough to produce the evolved form. This philosophy of earned evolution, where the progression of a Pokémon from one form to another was tied to something more than combat experience or reaching a numerical threshold, felt consistent with Sinnoh's broader themes. The mythology valued the bonds between people and Pokémon. The story's central conflict involved a villain who could not form such bonds, and the mechanical systems embedded in the games reinforced the message that paying attention to the creature in your party, treating it as a companion rather than a tool, produced tangible results. Cyrus might have seen those results as inefficiency. The games framed them as the entire point. The way Sinnoh's story ends with Cyrus is quieter than the endings of some other team leader narratives in the series. He does not reform. He does not loudly renounce his goals. In the main game, he simply disappears into the dimension opened by Dialga or Palkia, and whether he survived that disappearance is left unresolved. Platinum expands on this by having him appear in the Distortion world, where he encounters Giratina and does not flee from it, but stands before it with a kind of recognition, as though he has found a place that makes sense to him. Whether that is meant as defeat or as a different kind of arrival, the game leaves open. It is one of the more thoughtful endings for a villain in the series, treating his interiority with more respect than a simple defeat or capture. Standing at the end of Diamond and Pearl, having explored everything, having walked through the snow to Snow Point, and climbed to Spear Pillar, and chased Mesprit across the routes, and earned the right to face Cynthia, there is a particular kind of quiet that settles over the experience. The game is not trying to hold you with spectacle. It is simply present, complete, waiting without urgency for whatever comes next. The credits roll with music that is both celebratory and peaceful, and when the world opens again for the post-game, it does so without fanfare, simply revealing that there is more here if you want it. More routes, and more Pokemon, and more challenges, available without insistence. That quality of quiet availability, of a game that offers without demanding, is perhaps the thing that stays longest with people who played Diamond and Pearl at the right age. The games asked nothing more than your attention and your time, and they returned those investments with a region that had been imagined with genuine care, a mythology that treated the question of why anything exists as worth asking seriously, and a collection of Pokémon that, despite the limitations of the regional Pokédex, included some of the most beloved creatures in the series. Sinnoh was imperfect, and it was earnest, and it was slow, and it was full of history, and all of those things together made it somewhere worth coming back to. The gym leaders of Sinnoh are among the more carefully characterized in the series, each one embedded in the region's world, in ways that make them feel like inhabitants rather than simply obstacles. Rourke, the first gym leader, is Oreburgh City's own rock-type specialist, and his decision to work in the mines alongside the people he leads, rather than simply to oversee them, communicates something about the values the game wants to establish early. He is young, his red hair and hard hat suggesting someone who came to the role not through age, but through genuine investment in the town he represents. Beating him feels less like overcoming a gatekeeper and more like earning the respect of someone who takes their community seriously. Giratina is found in Eterna City and specializes in grass types, and her personality is one of energetic enthusiasm for wild Pokemon. She spends time in Eterna Forest the same way Professor Rowan spends time in the field, not because she has to, but because she genuinely wants to. She loves the shapes of living things. She loves watching how plants grow toward light and how Pokemon move through environments that suit them. Her gym's puzzle involves navigating through a garden maze to find her hidden trainers, and the sense of moving through a carefully tended space before reaching her carries through the entire encounter. Maylene leads the Veilstone City Gym and uses fighting types, and she is the third gym leader in the order of Sinnoh, but the fifth city the player reaches, creating the situation where the player passes through Veilstone and sees her gym before they have the badge required to challenge her. She is serious and quiet, her fighting type mastery reflecting a discipline that feels personal rather than performed. Her gym puzzle involves sliding across slick floors to navigate to each of her trainers, and the sensation of losing control of direction and having to correct gradually mirrors something about how the fighting type itself works, power that requires precise application to be effective. Wake is the water-type leader of Pastoria City, and he is one of the more physically imposing gym leaders in the series, large and loud in personality, his appearance suggesting someone who has spent a great deal of time near water and has been shaped by it. He cares about the Great Marsh in the way everyone in Pastoria seems to, and his gym is built around navigating channels of water that separate platforms, the player having to find their way through a maze of blocked passages to reach him. His team is constructed to take advantage of what water types can do, and facing him without preparation for his Floatzel's speed creates a battle that moves faster than the player expects. Byron is the Steel-type leader of Canalave City, a coastal city on the western edge of Sinnoh, reachable only after the player learns Surf. His gym is a series of platforms and elevators, the player ascending and descending through its industrial structure to reach the various trainers stationed there. Byron is Rourke's father, which the game reveals through their interaction when Team Galactic infiltrates the library in Canalave, and the relationship between them has a particular texture. Rourke values community and puts himself in the mine with his workers. Byron values heritage, the preservation of history through steel and stone. They are similar in their seriousness and different in where they direct it, and the game lets that relationship exist as a quiet piece of characterization without drawing too much attention to it. Candace leads the Snow Point gym and uses ice types, and reaching her requires the journey through the blizzard routes that make the northern part of Sinnoh feel so remote. Her gym is a puzzle of ice panels that slide the player in fixed directions when walked across, requiring the player to plan several moves ahead before committing to a path. She is warm in personality despite her ice typing, and her friendship with Maylene, the fighting type leader from Veilstone, is mentioned in dialogue and in later post-game content in ways that suggest the gym leaders of Sinnoh have genuine relationships with each other independent of their roles. They are not isolated in their cities. They know each other and they care about each other and the region they all serve. Volkner is the final gym leader, based in Sunishore City, and his gym requires the player to rotate the direction of electrical current through a series of switches to illuminate a path to him. He is the most technically complex gym puzzle in the game, and the effort required to reach Volkner reflects something about him. He has been the gym leader of Sunishore for a very long time, and he has become bored with it, having defeated every challenger who came to him with such ease that the win stopped meaning anything. When the player arrives, Flint has already persuaded him to stay and try once more, and the battle with Volkner has the quality of watching someone remember why they cared about something. He is genuinely one of the more interesting gym leader characterizations in the series, his ennui and his rekindled interest, both legible in how his dialogue is written. The Pokémon that populate Sinnoh's early routes deserve attention because first impressions in a new Pokémon game carry outsized importance. The player's first wild encounters in the tall grass above Twinleaf Town are Starly and Bidoof, and the combination communicates something about what kind of region this is. Starly is a bird with unremarkable coloring that will become something remarkable, its potential invisible at first glance. Bidoof is a round and somewhat hapless beaver, with an expression of cheerful vacantness, and it became something of a community mascot through the collective affection that players developed for its complete disregard for intimidation. Bidoof does not know it is unimpressive, and that quality makes it charming in a way that more obviously designed Pokémon sometimes are not. Bidoof appears on Route 24 in the early game, a small bud clamped together against the cold, its vines wrapped around itself protectively. It is a grass and poison type that evolves into Roselia through friendship during the day, and the condition of that evolution, requiring not just time, but genuine care, places it among the Pokémon that reward a particular kind of attention from the player. A Budu raised carelessly never becomes a Roselia. One that is walked with and used in battles and given items will open up over time, its evolution reflecting the relationship rather than simply the level count. Roserade, its second evolution, is one of the most visually elegant Pokémon in the generation, a dancer wearing roses for hands, its design suggesting grace and precision rather than brute force. Buizel, the sea otter Pokémon found along the water routes of Sinnoh, is a fast and cheerful water type whose design centers on a flotation sac around its neck that it uses to keep its head above water while swimming. It evolves into Floatzel, which is sleeker and faster and carries itself with the easy confidence of something very comfortable in its environment. Floatzel was significant in competitive play as one of the faster water-type Pokémon available with a good physical attack stat and reliable access to moves like Aqua Jet, which allowed it to hit before faster opponents could act. The design across both stages communicates motion and ease, the visual suggestion of something that has never had to struggle against its own element. Shellos comes in two versions depending on where in Sinnoh it is found. The West Sea form, found on the western routes before the player crosses Mount Coronet, is pink and round with a soft frilled appearance. The East Sea form, found on the eastern side of the mountain, is blue and angular with a different shape to its frills and a different face. Both evolve into their respective gastrodon forms, water and ground types, with substantial bulk and an immunity to electric type attacks that made them useful defensive options in a generation where electric types were significant threats. The existence of two regional forms for Shellos, connected to the geography of Sinnoh, implied a history in the lore where the species had once been connected and gradually differentiated across the barrier that Mount Coronet created, and that piece of world building, embedded in a Pokemon's design rather than stated in dialogue, reflected the game's approach of trusting careful players to notice things. Gallaudet is a psychic and fighting type that evolves from a male Kirlia exposed to a Dawnstone, and its design is a counterpart to Gardevoir, the psychic type that had existed since Generation 3. Gardevoir is elegant and sweeping, its design suggesting a figure from ballet or from a romantic tradition of graceful protectors. Galad is upright and bladed, its forearms extending into sharp green blades that suggest a knight rather than a dancer. The relationship between the two designs, evolving from the same line but diverging based on a combination of gender and a specific evolutionary item, communicates something about how single Pokemon lines can contain multitudes. Gardevoir and Galad are not competing designs. They are two answers to the same question. Roserade appeared in Generation 4 as the evolution of Roselia, and its design refines the rose-based concept into something that feels genuinely complete. Where Roselia is cute and somewhat simple, Roserade wears a mask and carries roses that conceal the toxic barbs hidden within them. Its Pokédex entries describe it as luring prey with its beautiful appearance and then striking with its concealed weaponry, which gives the elegant design a layer of danger that prevents it from being simply decorative. Roserade was frequently used in competitive play as a grass type with access to toxic spikes, a move that poisons opposing Pokémon as they enter the field, making it a hazard-setting option that rewarded careful team building. Drapion is a poison and dark type that evolves from Skorupi, and its design draws from scorpion anatomy in a way that enlarges and distorts the original silhouette into something more imposing. Its claws are enormous, and its tail curves over its body in a posture of permanent readiness. The poison and dark typing gave it an unusual defensive profile with very few weaknesses, ground-type attacks being the main vulnerability, and it was durable enough to serve as a genuine threat in the mid-game and beyond. Its appearance in Aaron's Elite Four team gave players their first look at how a careful trainer could use Drapion's defensive qualities to manage the flow of a battle. Toxicroak is another poison type, introduced in Generation 4, evolving from Croagunk, and its design reflects the poisonous dart frogs of real-world ecology in a way that commits fully to the concept. Its red throat sac is prominent, its posture is aggressive, and its combination of poison and fighting typing gave it access to an interesting set of moves. It could absorb water-type attacks through its ability Dry Skin, healing itself from moves that would normally do nothing, which made it a particularly interesting partner in rain teams as the competitive scene began to develop. Croagunk was a recurring presence in the Pokemon anime of the period, using its poison jab on a character who it apparently found objectionable, and that visibility gave it a recognition that extended beyond players who had reached the roots where it appeared. Mime Jr. is a normal and psychic type pre-evolution of Mr. Mime introduced in Generation 4, and its presence in Sinnoh raised the question of why a Pokemon so closely associated with Kanto's cities would have a baby form found in a mountain range. The answer, perhaps, is that Generation 4 was concerned with completing families across the Pokédex rather than maintaining strict geographic coherence. Mime Jr. was obtainable in Sinnoh through a method involving the use of odd incense when breeding Mr. Mime, meaning it was never simply found in the wild, but had to be deliberately sought through the breeding mechanics. This deliberateness placed it among the Pokémon that rewarded players who had learned how the game's hidden systems worked. Bonsly and Happiny were similarly obtained through incense breeding, baby Pokémon that required specific held items to produce from their parent forms. Bonsly, the pre-evolution of Sudowoodo, is perhaps the most memorable of these. Its disguise is a small plant, maintained even in its baby form, a rock type that looks like a leafy shoot before it develops into the more obviously tree-shaped Sudowoodo. The joke of Sudowoodo's design, a rock type that looks exactly like a plant, becomes slightly more elaborate when a baby Bonsly is considered, the disguise beginning so early that it seems like the species has no other way of thinking about itself. The evolution stones introduced or made more accessible in Generation 4 shaped how players thought about building their teams. The shiny stone, a new item introduced in the generation, was required to evolve Togetic into Togekiss and Roselia into Roserade. The dusk stone evolved Misdreavus into Mismagius and Murkrow into Honchkrow. The dawn stone evolved male Kirlia into Galad and female Snorant into Froslass. The Razor Claw and Razor Fang were held items that, when carried by specific Pokémon while leveling up at night, produced Weevil and Gliscor respectively. The Protector was a held item that produced Rhyperior from Raiden when traded holding it. The Electorizer and Magmarizer traded to Electabuzz, and Magmar produced Electivire and Magmortar respectively. This proliferation of evolution conditions was more complex than the straightforward level up or stone evolutions of earlier generations, and it required either experimentation or external research to fully understand. Players who had not encountered a Pokémon's evolution method before would sometimes find the information through conversation with other players, through game publications, or through the emerging culture of online resources that surrounded the games. The sharing of evolution methods became a kind of social currency in the community around Diamond and Pearl, and knowing how to evolve something unusual was a small piece of expertise that could be passed on. The Sinnoh Safari Zone equivalent, the Great Marsh in Pastoria City, functioned on a slightly different system than the original Safari Zone. Players were given a set number of Safari balls and steps, and could attempt to catch the Pokémon found in the marsh's various wetland areas. The Pokémon available in the Great Marsh changed on a daily rotation, and checking the binoculars at the entrance to see which Pokémon were available on a given day became a small ritual for players who were hunting specific creatures. Tropius, Yanma, Carnivine, Shroomish, and others appeared through this rotation, their availability tied to the day rather than to any specific in-game condition. For players without access to information about the rotation schedule, the marsh had a quality of pleasant unpredictability, each visit potentially revealing something unexpected. Wayward Cave, beneath the cycling road on Route 26, is another location with a hidden depth that rewards careful exploration. The cave's first section is accessible through the main entrance and contains wild Pokémon and trainers in a darkened space that requires the use of flash or careful navigation to move through without constant disorientation. The hidden section, accessible through an entrance beneath the cycling road bridge, is where Geibel can be found, and it is genuinely hidden in the sense that the entrance is not marked on any map and cannot be seen unless the player specifically goes underneath the bridge and walks into the wall at the correct point. Finding it accidentally produces the particular satisfaction of discovering something the game was keeping from anyone who was not paying attention. Mount Gitstoke Coronet's internal geography is one of the more elaborate in the series. Its multiple entrances connecting different parts of Sinnoh and its interior, requiring different travel abilities at different points in the game. Early in the adventure, the player passes through lower sections to reach Oreburg from Jubilife, and those sections are simple and navigable. As the game progresses and more travel abilities become available, deeper and higher sections of the mountain open up, each one slightly more disorienting than the last, the sense of being inside something very old and very large increasing with altitude. The summit area, where Team Galactic's activities draw toward their climax, is bathed in a permanent blizzard that cuts visibility and makes every step feel more uncertain. Spear Pillar itself, when the player finally reaches it at the game's narrative peak, is both a profound moment and a visually understated one. The platform is broken. The columns are shattered stumps. There is no intact structure remaining, only the ruins of something that was here long before anyone now living was born. Team Galactic's commanders are defeated one by one in the approaches to the pillar, and the final confrontation with Cyrus occurs on this ancient ruin, with the sky split above it and the legendary Pokémon summoned into existence from the tear in reality. The games do not over-explain what Spear Pillar means. They let the player understand it from its context, from the mythology that has been accumulating across the entire journey. The Canalave Library is a building in the port city of Canalave that contains texts describing Sinnoh's mythology in ways that the player can read voluntarily. None of the library's books are required to complete the game, and nothing forces the player into the building beyond normal curiosity. But the texts inside describe the creation mythology in more detail than any other source in the game, laying out the full sequence of Arceus and the creation trio and the lake trio and what each was said to have contributed. Reading them feels like finding primary sources, like holding something that has been copied and preserved for reasons that were important to the people who preserved it. The library communicates that the people of Sinnoh valued knowledge enough to build a dedicated space for it in a port city and to maintain it across generations. The Veilstone City Game Corner was a casino-style feature present in Diamond and Pearl that allowed players to exchange coins for prizes including specific Pokémon and technical machines. The Game Corner had been a fixture of the series since the original Red and Blue, and in Sinnoh it retained the familiar slot machine interface and coin-based economy. The prizes available at the Veilstone Game Corner included Pokémon like Abra and Clefairy that could otherwise require either trading or extended exploration to obtain, and technical machines for moves that were not easily accessible through normal gameplay. Later versions of the games in different regions modified or removed the Game Corner in response to regional regulations around gambling imagery in games aimed at younger audiences, making the original Diamond and Pearl version one of the last full implementations of the feature in the core series. The department store in Veilstone City was the primary retail location for items that could not be found through other means, and its floors covered a range of items from standard Pokeballs and healing items on the lower floors to technical machines and held items higher up. The roof of the department store had a vending machine selling different types of water that could be used as healing items or given to specific trainers to receive technical machines in return, a small economic system embedded within the building that rewarded players who understood it. The department store's presence in Veilstone contributed to the city's character as a commercial and organizational hub, the location of both Team Galactic's headquarters and the region's most comprehensive shopping destination, creating an interesting juxtaposition that the game never acknowledges explicitly. The Pokémon Daycare in Sinnoh is located on Route 209 between Hearthome and Solaceon, and like previous iterations, it offered the service of leveling Pokémon through the accumulation of steps taken by the player while the Pokémon remained in its care. Two compatible Pokémon left together at the daycare could produce an egg, and the mechanics governing egg production, what constituted compatibility, what moves a hatched Pokémon would know, what the chances were of producing eggs with specific statistics, had become increasingly complex by Generation 4. Players who wanted to breed Pokémon with optimal statistics for competitive use needed to understand the IV system, the nature system, and how certain moves could only be passed down through specific breeding arrangements. The daycare was simple on its surface and enormously deep for players who wanted to understand everything it could do. The egg move system allowed Pokémon to hatch, knowing moves that they could not learn through leveling or technical machines alone, and some of these moves were essential to particular competitive builds. A Lucario that hatched knowing Vacuum Wave, for example, was a different Pokémon from one that had never learned it, capable of strategies that the standard level-up version could not replicate. Finding out which moves could be passed through breeding and which Pokémon were capable of passing them was a community project. Though information spreading through player networks and increasingly through online resources, the Pokémon breeding community that formed around Generation 4 was one of the more technically sophisticated communities in the series' history, developing a shared vocabulary and a body of knowledge that continues to inform competitive play in later games. The National Pokédex in Diamond and Pearl opened up after the player had seen all 151 Pokémon in the Sinnoh Regional Pokédex, not caught them, merely encountered or received them enough to have their data registered. Obtaining all Sinnoh Pokédex data was a reasonable goal for a dedicated player, requiring some trades, as in some specific encounters, but nothing beyond what the game itself provided. Professor Oak awarded the National Pokédex upon completion, appearing in the game to deliver it personally, a moment of ceremony that acknowledged the accomplishment before expanding the game's scope to include Pokémon from all previous generations. The National Pokédex expansion was one of the signals that the postgame was fully open. The move Stealth Rock, introduced in Generation 4 as a technical machine, became one of the most significant additions to competitive Pokémon play in the series' history. It was an entry hazard move, similar in concept to Spikes, which placed invisible rocks around the opponent's side of the field that dealt damage to any Pokémon switching into battle based on their vulnerability to rock-type attacks. The damage ranged from a small fraction of health for resistant Pokémon to half a Pokémon's maximum health for those with double weakness to rock, and for Pokémon with 4 times weakness to rock, like the bug and flying-type Pokémon common to many teams. The damage on entry was so severe that it fundamentally changed how those Pokémon could be used. Stealth Rock reshaped the competitive landscape of Generation 4 and beyond, creating a context where setting entry hazards and removing them with moves like Rapid Spin became a central tactical consideration. Toxic Spikes, also introduced in Generation 4, placed poison on the field that affected switching Pokémon rather than dealing direct damage, and the 2-layer version poisoned Pokémon with the more severe badly poisoned status that dealt increasing damage over time. The interaction between toxic spikes and poison-type Pokémon, which would absorb the spikes and remove them from the field when switching in, created a defensive option for teams using poison types, while also explaining why certain poison-type Pokémon became more valuable as team members in this era of competitive play. The Dafog move, which the player was sometimes forced to use as an HM to remove weather effects from routes, had a secondary function in competitive battles of clearing all entry hazards from both sides of the field. This gave Defog a legitimate competitive use, alongside its frustrating HM application, and it became one of the standard hazard removal options for teams that wanted to keep their side of the field clear. The dual role of Dafog, annoying in the single-player game and legitimately useful in the competitive context, is one of the more interesting examples of a move having completely different value depending on the context in which it was used. Wide lens and zoom lens were new held items in Generation 4 that modified the accuracy of moves, the former increasing the user's accuracy slightly for all moves, and the latter increasing accuracy significantly when the user moved after the opponent. These items made moves with lower base accuracy more reliable, and players who wanted to use powerful but inaccurate moves like Stone Edge or Fire Blast without accepting the full accuracy cost found these items useful. The trade-off between high power and lower accuracy was one of the consistent design tensions in Pokémon move design, and Generation 4 gave players additional tools to navigate it. The move Trick Room, also introduced in Generation 4, reversed the priority of speed in battle for a set number of turns, making the slowest Pokémon move first. This opened an entirely new competitive archetype, Trick Room teams, built around very slow but very powerful Pokémon that would normally be outpaced by the faster opponents they faced. Bronzong, a Steel and Psychic type introduced in Generation 4, was one of the primary setters of Trick Room. Its low speed combined with excellent bulk, making it ideal for establishing the reversed speed condition and then surviving long enough for its slower partners to do damage. The existence of Trick Room as a strategy made battles more dynamic because teams had to consider not just how fast and how strong they were, but how they would respond to a world where fast became slow. Bronzong itself is worth considering as a design. It is a large bronze bell, ancient in appearance, its surface patinated with age, and it floats with the stillness of something that does not need to hurry because it has been waiting for a very long time. Its design draws from the bronze bells of Japanese temples, objects with centuries of use and cultural significance, and the simple decision to make that cultural reference into a Pokémon produced something that fits Sinnoh's atmosphere of preserved antiquity perfectly. Bronzong can have the ability Levitate, which removes its ground-type weakness and leaves it with only one vulnerability, to fire, making it almost impervious to attack under the right conditions. It became a staple of defensive team construction in Generation 4's competitive scene for exactly that reason. Garchomp's competitive impact in Generation 4 was significant enough that it was eventually moved to the Uber tier, the highest tier in the competitive community's classification system, reserved for Pokémon considered too powerful for standard play. Its speed and attack statistics were exceptional, its dragon and ground typing gave it excellent coverage, and its access to Sword Stance allowed it to double its already high attack with a single turn of setup. A Garchomp that had used Sword Dance once threatened to end battles very quickly, and the difficulty of stopping it before it could set up or revenge killing it after it had done so was a persistent challenge for teams in the Generation 4 era. The Scarf Garchomp variant, which held a choice scarf to boost its speed even further, was similarly difficult to handle and did not require setup turns to threaten. Gengar, a Pokémon present since Generation 1, found renewed utility in Generation 4 through the physical and special split. Its Ghost-type attacks became special category, matching its high special attack stat, and it could now use them effectively in ways that had been mechanically awkward before. Gengar's Shadow Ball, a special Ghost-type attack, became a reliable damage option, and its combination of high speed and high special attack with good coverage moves made it a threatening presence in the Generation 4 competitive scene. Its ability Levitate removed the ground-type weakness that most poison types shared, leaving it with weaknesses primarily to Psychic and Dark and Ghost, types that were present on many teams, but that Gengar's speed often allowed it to outpace and eliminate first. Weevil is a Dark and Ice type that evolves from Sneasel when leveled up at night holding a Razor Claw, and its design is one of the more striking in the generation. A sleek and sharp-featured creature with a red feather-like crest and the posture of something that moves at the edges of perception rather than through the center of it. Its high speed and attack statistics made it a significant threat in competitive play, and the dark and ice typing gave it access to moves targeting some of the most commonly used Pokémon of the era. Its weakness to fighting type moves was exploitable by the competitive community, but finding an opportunity to use that weakness against a Weevil that was moving before anything else on the field was not straightforward. Togekiss arrived in Generation 4 as the evolution of Togetic, which had existed since Generation 2 without a final form, and its design is a departure from what the earlier stages suggested. Togepi is small and egg-shaped. Togetic is a small fairy-like creature with wings, and Togekiss is large and elegant, a sweeping white bird with a face that carries an expression of complete serenity. Its move pool included powerful psychic and flying attacks, alongside status moves and the significant Air Slash, which had a high chance of causing the opponent to flinch, losing their turn. Combined with a high speed when holding certain items or in certain conditions, Togekiss could use Air Slash repeatedly to prevent opponents from acting, a strategy known as flinch hacks that was both effective and controversial. Its ability Serene Grace doubled the probability of moves' secondary effects, making the flinch chance on Air Slash even more significant. The Pokémon Platinum version story changes included an expanded role for the character Looker that added texture to the post-game narrative. After the main story concluded in Platinum, Looker could be found conducting an investigation into the remnants of Team Galactic, tracking the commanders who had not been directly dealt with during the main events. This extended investigation gave players a reason to revisit areas they had already explored and provided closure on the stories of characters whose fates had been left ambiguous after the main story ended. Saturn, the most ambivalent of the commanders, was found to have broken with the organization, his own doubts having finally overcome his loyalty. The investigation format of this post-game content was a precursor to the more elaborate Looker chapters that would appear in later generations. Shaman's Sky form, introduced in Platinum, is accessible through the Grassidea flower, an item obtainable from a character in Floroma Town when a shaman is in the party. The transformation changes Shaman from its land form, a small hedgehog-like creature covered in white fur and green flowers, into its Sky form, a longer creature with wings and a different set of flowers along its body. Sky form Shaman has a different type combination, becoming grass and flying rather than pure grass, and its speed and special attack statistics are significantly higher, making it a very different competitive proposition. The transformation could only occur during the day and would revert if Shaman was put in a box or if night fell, which gave the Sky form a temporal quality, something that existed only under specific conditions, visible only at the right moment. Giratina's origin form, available in Platinum through the Grigious Orb item, functions similarly, transforming the altered form that appears in Diamond and Pearl into a longer, more serpentine shape with different statistics. The origin form has higher special attack and special defense, but lower physical defense and attack than the altered form, making the choice of which held item to give it a genuine strategic decision. Carrying the Grigious Orb also powers up Giratina's Ghost and Dragon type moves, adding another layer to the trade-off. Both forms were available in Platinum simultaneously, the player able to switch between them by giving or removing the orb, which gave Giratina a versatility that most legendary Pokémon did not have. The connectivity between Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum and the Pokémon Ranger games, the Pokémon Mystery Dungeon games, and other spin-off titles released during the same period created a sense of the Generation 4 era as a connected ecosystem of experiences rather than a single game. Pokémon Ranger Shadows of Almia, released alongside Platinum, allowed players to receive a Riolu egg that could be sent to Diamond, Pearl, or Platinum, producing a Riolu that knew Aurasphere, a move it could not normally learn through leveling. This connectivity rewarded players who engaged with multiple parts of the Pokémon product landscape, and it was the most direct form of cross-title connection the series had managed at that point. The Pokémon Mystery Dungeon games, released during Generation 4, Explorers of Time and Explorers of Darkness, followed by Explorers of Sky, told their own stories set in a world of Pokémon without human trainers, and while they were not mechanically connected to Diamond and Pearl in the way Ranger was, they expanded the Generation 4 Pokémon's presence across the era. Seeing Pokémon like Grovyle, Dusknoir, and Palkia in the context of a different kind of story, one focused on time travel and friendship and sacrifice, gave those designs an emotional resonance that carried back into how players thought about them in the main games. Route 230 is the last route before Pokémon League access and runs south from the Victory Road entrance, and it has a quality of finality to it, a calm before the ascent. The wild Pokémon there are strong, the trainers on the route have well-developed teams, and the music carries the measured weight of a place that knows it is near the end of something. Players who served south from the route could find an old man who would give a TM as a reward for visiting a remote area that had no other accessible function, a small gesture of reward for curiosity carried all the way to the edge of the accessible world. The Victory Road Cave in Sinnoh is one of the longer implementations of the standard pre-league dungeon in the series. Its multiple floors require different HMs to navigate fully, and the wild Pokémon in its depths include some of the strongest available in the pre-national Pokédex game. Raiden, Steelix, Medicum, and Floatzel appear in its chambers, their high levels providing both a gauge of how strong the player's team should be before the league and an opportunity for final preparation. The cave has a geography that loops back on itself in ways that require attention to navigate without getting turned around, and the sense of emergence when the exit finally appears and the league building comes into view is one of the small satisfactions that a long dungeon earns through its length. The Pokémon League building in Sinnoh is a restrained structure, not ornate but imposing in the way that something built for serious purpose rather than spectacle tends to be. The interior is quiet, the Pokémon Center inside offering a final point of preparation before the player commits to the Elite Four sequence, and the atmosphere of the building communicates that what happens here is treated with gravity. The Elite Four rooms each have their own aesthetic, each one reflecting the type that the trainer inside specializes in, and the journey from Aaron's bug-filled chamber through Bertha's stone and earth to Lucien's crystalline psychic space to the final doors behind which Cynthia waits has a quality of ceremony. The games know they are building towards something, and they take their time. The post-credits scene in Diamond and Pearl is brief, returning control to the player in Twinleaf Town with a simple prompt from the player character's mother about the television being on. Professor Rowan's Pokémon have been seen across the Sinnoh region, the broadcast announces, and the post-game's opening gesture toward the National Pokédex and the wider world beyond Sinnoh's borders begins with that small, ordinary moment in a small, ordinary town. The return to Twinleaf after everything that has happened in the preceding hours of play has a particular quality, a recognition that the player character came from somewhere, and that somewhere is still there, unchanged, waiting just as it always was. The Twinleaf Festival, mentioned in some of the dialogue of the town's residents, and in the backstory Barry and the player character share, suggests a history to the town that predates the player's adventure there. The town has celebrations. It has traditions. The two childhood friends who set off on their journeys at the beginning of the game came from a place with a past, And the small gestures toward that past and the dialogue of the residents give Twinleaf a quality that purely functional starting towns sometimes lack. It is not just a place the player passes through, it is a place they are from. The sound of Sinnoh at different times of day was shaped in part by the DAOS hardware's capacity for environmental audio, and the roots of the region had subtle differences depending on whether the player was traveling in daylight or after dark. Certain Pokémon appeared only at night, others only during the day, and the shift in the wild encounter tables between the morning, daytime, and nighttime periods meant that a player who explored the same route at different hours would find a different Sinnoh each time. Clefairy and Cleffa and Bonsly and other Pokémon had time-specific availability, and the Pokéch's clock application tracked the in-game time regardless of whether the player was consulting it, the world of Sinnoh moving through its own cycle independently of what the player happened to be doing. The Roto Lotto was a daily feature, accessible in a Pokémon Center in Sinnoh, offering a random selection of prizes to players who checked in each day. The prizes ranged from simple healing items to rare candies to technical machines, and the daily reset of the lottery created a small incentive for players to return to the game consistently, even when they had no specific goal in mind. These daily incentives, small reasons to check in that rewarded regularity without punishing absence, became a more elaborate feature in later games, but in Diamond and Pearl they existed in a modest and undemanding form that suited the game's overall relationship with the player's time. The lottery corner in the Pokémon Center below floor also offered a chance to win prizes based on the ID numbers of Pokémon in the player's boxes, and the ID number matching requirement meant that receiving a traded Pokémon from another player's game, which would have that player's unique ID rather than the current player's own, increased the chances of matching the lottery's draw number. This created a small mechanical incentive for trading that existed entirely within the back end of the game's systems and that most players were unaware of unless they researched it. The depth of Generation 4's systems was partly visible and partly hidden, and the hidden parts rewarded players who dug into the mechanics without necessarily requiring that dig from anyone who simply wanted to complete the story. The honey trees of Sinnoh are perhaps the most patient mechanic in the generation. Yellow honey obtained from the Pokémon Apom's man, or purchased from him, could be smeared on specially marked trees found on various routes, and after a waiting period of roughly 6 real-world hours, the tree might have attracted a Pokémon. The Pokémon available from honey trees included some that were not easily found elsewhere, including Munchlax, the pre-evolution of Snorlax, which could appear at a small subset of the honey trees, the specific trees determined by a hidden calculation based on the trainer's secret ID, a number assigned at the start of the game that was not visible to the player. Finding which trees were the Munchlax trees for a specific save file required either the willingness to try every tree repeatedly or external tools that could read the hidden ID and determine the calculation's result. The patience required by the honey tree mechanic and the willingness to check trees after real hours had passed made finding honey tree Pokémon a genuinely time-extended activity, and the Pokémon found there, Combee, Burmy, Apom, Heracross, Wurmple, Silcoon, Cascoon, and the elusive Munchlax, were encountered with a particular quality of satisfaction that immediately available Pokémon could not produce. There is something different about an encounter that was waited for. It carries the weight of the waiting with it, and that weight gives it more presence in memory than a random encounter on a route ever could. The Pokémon Platinum Remake of 2009 updated the distribution of Pokémon encounters in the wild, adding creatures from previous generations to routes where they had not appeared in Diamond and Pearl, and this had the practical effect of improving type diversity available to players building teams before the postgame. Magmar and Electabuzz appeared in certain areas, giving players access to the pre-evolutions of the newly introduced Magmortar and Electivire without requiring the national Pokédex. Houndoom and Togetic appeared in areas accessible before the League, and these additions collectively made Platinum a more balanced experience for players who wanted options during the main story. The Distortion World's visual logic rewards close attention. The platforms and pathways of Giratina's dimension do not follow any consistent rule except the absence of ordinary rules, and the player navigates it by finding waterfalls that run upward, by walking paths that curve in impossible directions, by encountering the terrain from angles that should not be possible given where the player entered it. Cyrus is found there before the player reaches Giratina, standing before the legendary Pokémon with the apparent intention of commanding it, and his failure to do so is not dramatic. He simply cannot. The world he wanted to rebuild from nothing has instead found him in a place that is already nothing, and what he makes of that is left for the player to consider on their own. The music that plays in the Distortion World is unlike any other track in Generation 4, its composition using unusual harmonic choices that suggest a space where normal relationships between musical elements have been suspended. It is not unpleasant to listen to, but it does not resolve in the way that music trained on conventional patterns expects to resolve, and that quality of suspended tension is appropriate to an environment where gravity does not behave predictably, and where the figure standing in its depths once tried to unmake the universe. The music of the Distortion World is one of the Generation 4 soundtrack's most discussed pieces, and its effect is the result of deliberate compositional choice rather than accident. Everything in Diamond and Pearl eventually comes back to the mountain at the center, to the thing that was there before the cities, and before the roads, and before the trainers and their journeys. Sinnoh built itself around Mount Coronet, grew outward from the geology that divides it, arranged its history and its mythology and its people around the fact of that mountain's presence. And the games do not let you forget it. You see it from the west before you can cross it, and you see it from the east after you have. You ascend it at the game's climax, and you descend it again, and it is still there when you return to whatever else the game has left to offer. It is always there, patient in the way that things shaped by geological time tend to be patient, aware in the way that the mythology says it should be aware, the place where the world began and where the world, in the game's own terms, nearly ended. Sinnoh's answer to that nearness is the same as its answer to everything. Hold on to what was given to you. The emotion and the knowledge and the willpower offered by 3 small Pokémon in 3 cold lakes, waiting quietly for someone to come and notice. The gifts are there if you want them. The past is there if you look. The mountain is there whether you look or not, and it will still be there when you are ready to climb it again. The design of the Sinnoh towns and cities reflects different stages of the region's historical relationship with the land that surrounds them. Oreburgh exists because coal was found beneath the mountain, the city growing upward from the need to extract something useful from the earth. Jubilife exists because someone recognized that a crossroads city would serve travelers moving between the eastern and western halves of the region. Eterna exists because people gathered around the statue and never left, the monument becoming the center of gravity for everything that grew up around it. These origin stories are implied rather than stated, and they give each city a quality of having arrived at its current form through time and circumstance rather than through design. Veilstone City is different. Its layout is angular, and its purpose is explicitly commercial and organizational. The department store, its most prominent landmark, and Team Galactic's headquarters, its most imposing. Veilstone does not feel like it grew organically. It feels like it was planned, which gives it a slightly colder character than the other cities in Sinnoh. It is not unwelcoming exactly, but it is the place where things are bought and sold, and where an organization that wants to remake the universe has established its formal headquarters. And those facts give it an edge that Floroma or Celestic does not have. The meteor shards that can be found on the route approaching Veilstone suggest ancient impacts, the sky having delivered something to this particular corner of Sinnoh in some distant past, and the city that formed here carries that history of impact in its geography. Sunny Shore City sits on the eastern coast and is built on a series of elevated walkways above its lower streets, powered by the solar panels that Volkner designed to run the city's electrical infrastructure. The concept of a city that has committed to a renewable energy source that has built its entire design around the continuous conversion of sunlight into power is an interesting one for a Pokémon game to introduce, and it does so without commentary or didacticism, simply presenting a city that works this way and leaving the player to consider it. Sunny Shore is the most technologically self-conscious city in Sinnoh, and that self-consciousness is an expression of its gym leader's character, because Volkner built these systems as an expression of his interest in electricity, the same interest that made him a gym leader, the same interest that the boredom of easy wins had nearly extinguished. The lighthouse in Sunny Shore is a location mentioned in passing dialogue as the place where Flint spent time trying to convince Volkner not to give up on being a gym leader, and that detail, a conversation between two friends in a lighthouse by the sea, exists only in the words of a character who mentions it without elaborating. It is one of those small pieces of the game's world that exists just beyond what the player can see, a moment that happened before the player arrived and that shaped what the player encounters. The games are full of these moments, pieces of history and relationship that the dialogue gestures toward without fully depicting, and they are part of what gives Sinnoh its quality of being inhabited by people with lives that extend beyond what the player witnesses. The Game Freak offices in Hardham City, a small nod to the developer team, included in the game itself, allow the player to interact with characters who represent the people who made the game. A developer can be spoken to who will offer a certificate commemorating the player's progress, and other staff members scattered through the offices will comment on various aspects of the game and the experience of making it. These moments of developer presence embedded within the game world itself are a tradition in the series, and their inclusion in Diamond and Pearl maintains that tradition while also grounding it in Hardhome's character as a city of culture and performance. Even the game's makers can exist in Sinnoh, working and talking and being part of the world they created. The Pokémon News Press in Solison Town publishes a daily newspaper about Pokémon, and bringing a particular Pokémon to the editor based on that day's publication rewards the player with a small prize. The system refreshes daily and requires different Pokémon on different days, creating another small daily ritual for players who wanted to engage with it. The existence of a functioning newspaper in a small town, one that covers Pokémon rather than human affairs, adds a texture to Sinnoh's world that suggests the region's relationship with Pokémon extends into its media landscape and its cultural conversation. People in Sinnoh not only live alongside Pokémon, they write about them, read about them, and share that interest as a community. The Selasion ruins adjacent to the town contain rooms of unknown in various letter forms, and completing the unknown alphabet, catching one of each of the 28 available forms, fills a separate section of the Pokédex. The ruins have a puzzle quality to their interior, the layout requiring navigation through a sequence of rooms that must be reached in a particular order, and finding all of the unknown forms means returning multiple times to different chambers. The reward for completing the unknown collection includes access to a special room containing items and a sealed corridor that provides no further content, but that implies, through its existence, that whatever the unknown were originally communicating has not been fully understood. The ruins know more than they are saying. The mystery remains open. The Sunny Shore Market, unique to Platinum, is a rotating market that appears on certain days and sells items not otherwise available in the region. The concept of a market that comes and goes, that is present on some days and absent on others, adds a quality of unpredictability to Sunny Shore's commercial life that the permanent stores of other cities do not have. Finding the market on one of its active days and discovering what it has for sale creates the small pleasure of encountering something that was not guaranteed to be there, something that rewarded the decision to look. Trainer tower equivalents and special battle facilities in Generation 4 extended beyond the battle frontier to include locations where players could test themselves in specific challenge formats. The 7 Stars restaurant in Valor Lakefront offered double battle challenges with a partner selected from available Pokémon, and completing its successive dinner courses against increasingly difficult opponent pairs required a different kind of preparation than single battle facilities. The restaurant framing, meals as battles, battle courses as dinner service, gave the facility a distinctive character that made it feel like a piece of Sinnoh's social world rather than simply a mechanical challenge. The Lake Trio's individual locations, Lake Verity near Twinleaf, Lake Valor near Pastoria, and Lake Acuity near Snow Point, are each embedded in significant moments of the game's narrative. Team Galactic targets all 3 lakes simultaneously, their plan requiring the capture of all 3 lake guardians to extract the red chain needed to summon Dialga and Palkia. The player can only respond to one crisis at a time, and arriving at each lake after Team Galactic has already acted means encountering the aftermath rather than preventing it. The lake drained or disturbed, the guardian gone. This structure of being one step behind, of responding to consequences rather than preventing causes, gives the Team Galactic narrative a quality of inevitability that makes the final confrontation feel more urgent than it would if the player had been able to stop them at each stage. Lake Acuity, the northernmost of the 3, and the site of Barry's defeat at Jupiter's hands, has a particular weight because of what it represents in the rival story. Barry arrived there first, as he arrives everywhere first, and faced Jupiter without enough preparation and lost. The player arrives to find him there, processing what happened, and the conversation between them has the quality of a turning point. Barry does not become a different person after Acuity, but he becomes a more careful one, and the game marks that change without overemphasizing it, trusting the player to understand what the defeat and the subsequent growth mean without spelling it out. The post-game of Diamond and Pearl in its complete form, including the Battle Zone Island, the expanded Pokédex, the legendary encounters, and the competitive facilities, represents a volume of content that can occupy as many hours as the main game itself for dedicated players. This generosity with post-game content was recognized at the time and remains one of the generation's notable qualities. The main story had a clear and satisfying conclusion, and everything beyond it was offered as a continuation rather than a correction, more of something good rather than a fixing of something insufficient. Stark Mountain, reachable only through the battle zone's fight area and then through survival area routes, is a volcanic landscape that stands in contrast to Sinnoh's predominantly cold and mountainous character. Its interior is a long dungeon of fire and rock, and navigating it requires partnering with Buck, whose presence and dialogue during the ascent add context to the location without overwhelming it with narrative. The mountain's volcanic character connects it to Heatran, the steel and fire type that waits in its deepest chamber, and the pairing of a volcanic legendary with a volcanic environment is the kind of ecological matching that the games do well when they do it deliberately. Heatran belongs here in the way that the Abomasnow belong in the Blizzard roots, the creature and the place having a relationship that makes both feel more complete. The Flower Paradise accessible through Shaman's event in Platinum is reached via a path of flowers that blooms in response to a specific action, and its design is brief and contained. A small meadow at the end of a short route, with Shaman resting in its center. The restraint of the area reflects Shaman's character, in both its land form and the circumstances of its encounter. A small creature in a small, beautiful place, waiting quietly. The contrast between the enormity of what has preceded this encounter, the creation mythology, the legendary trios, the battle against an organization that wanted to destroy the universe, and the quiet simplicity of a hedgehog in a flower field is one of those tonal shifts that the games manage gracefully, proof that not everything needs to be monumental to be memorable. These are the things that Diamond and Pearl hold: the mountain and the mythology, the lake guardians and their gifts, the rival who learned to slow down, the champion who valued history, the villain who could not love anything, the underground tunnels and the honey trees and the daily rituals of a world that ran on its own time, the blizzard roots and the sealed temples and the old texts in a library no one required you to visit. All of it is there, patient and present, for whoever comes to look for it. And if you look for it now, in the quiet hours when the day has finished and the world outside is still, you will find it exactly where it always was. The mountain at the center of everything, the past that lives in the people who remember it, the gifts of emotion and knowledge and willpower, offered once and available still, waiting for anyone willing to receive them in the spirit in which they were given. The question of whether Pokémon Diamond and Pearl are really that good does not require a single answer, because different players came to them differently and found different things inside. Some found a slow and frustrating game built around an HM system that made exploration feel like housekeeping. Others found a region so carefully considered that every town had a purpose and every route had something worth stopping for. Both things are true. The games contain both experiences simultaneously, and which one a player remembers most clearly often has less to do with the games themselves than with the circumstances that surrounded those first hours in Sinnoh. The player who was cold and had nowhere to be and let the mountain music play while they walked slowly north through a blizzard remembers something the player who needed the credits to roll before dinner cannot fully share. There is a particular quality to games that were made during a period when their makers were still learning what they were making. Diamond and Pearl are full of decisions that were later reconsidered, systems that later iterations of the series replaced or removed or transformed into something more comfortable. But the core of what they were trying to do, the careful construction of a world with real mythology and real stakes and real characters, survived every version of the game and endures in the memory of everyone who spent time there. Sinnoh is not remembered in spite of its imperfections. It is remembered whole, imperfections and all, the way a place from childhood is remembered, not as it objectively was, but as it felt to be there. That is the nature of these particular games, and perhaps of games in general. They meet the player where the player is, and they give back something shaped by what was brought to them. Sinnoh gave its best to those who were not in a hurry, and its best was considerable. Thanks for watching. If these quiet details helped you relax, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. You can let it play as you close your eyes. You might hear something soothing before you fall asleep again.